Howdy. How's it going, guys? Welcome to another stream. Please let me know, first of all, if the audio is good, the video is good. I want to know everything about it. I'm going to check it out myself because I don't want this video to go wrong. As you can see, first of all, if you... Oh, yeah, dude, I forgot. Honestly, yeah, man. I should be more considerate to my European viewers. I mean, it's late here. It's like 8 p.m., so I can't even imagine what's it like over there. But howdy, guys. First of all, I bought a new mic. It's a Shure M7B. I think it's dope. It should be much better than the last one. So thank you guys for your support. I bought it. Looks good. Sounds good. Perfect. Today we're going to do, you know what's up. You know what's coming. Yeah, baby. That's right. Oh my God. I'm so excited about this, dude. You guys have hyped this video so freaking much, dude. The Turkish century from Hitties to Ataturk. Now, I do know a little bit about Turkish history, particularly late Turkish history. So, Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Republic, Turkish, was it Revolution? Because, they did fight the British. And I do know a little bit about the Ataturk. So today we're gonna, it's almost 2 hours long, dude. Man, my God. Either way. So let's do a little bit of introduction. Just, guys, if you like the content, give it a like, give it a share. You can check out my links in the description. The support always helps. But without further ado, man, let's not bore you to death with all this stuff. I want to check that the volume is perfect. Man, I do hope so. The Mexican-American border was pretty epic, but like I said, this has more views. You guys have hyped it up so much that I'm excited, man. I think I'm really gonna enjoy it because the history of Anatolia, which is the land that now we know as Turkey, is incredibly interesting and incredible. I mean, it goes very, very far in time. So this is gonna be really interesting. Plus, Ataturk is like late Turkish history. It's like 1910s, 1920s. So we're going to go a whole of Turkish history in 1.5 hours. Yep. So I'm glad that we have 2 viewers from the beginning. Thank you, guys. Thank you to T-Man and totally inconspicuous. Man, I still have to better my English. Anyway, dude.
What ties a people to their land? What makes land yours? How can land even be yours? The idea of the nation-state is barely 200 years old, and before that idea, the notion of land as a collective property of a cultural or national construct didn't exist. The land was owned by kings, and you lived on their land by their grace.
Absolutely.
The peoples who worked the lands had no rights over these lands, but were instead tolerated by kings, who themselves claimed to be tolerated by gods. The modern nation-state had to forge identities to justify their existence as sovereigns over said land. There are many means and ways to forge such justifications. Our most modern one is derived from adherence to common values or through an integration through language. Because of that, the academic histories of lands are...
Yeah, you guys tell me any problem and I'll try to fix it. My internet should be good. I mean, I'm seeing that YouTube is giving me excellent connection. So I hope it's good, but any trouble, guys, and I'll fix it. Plus, there'll be the video. So if the stream's not good, the video that comes later should be better.
Mostly separated into 2 parts. The story of the land itself and the story of those who live in it now. And this place here
this is
a great
so
example
true. I
of that
love that he's talking
separation.
about
the
this.
region is now mostly known.
Our concept, this is so true. This is so true. I fucking love this. The concept of the nation state is 200 years old. Before that, it just wasn't a thing. That's not how things worked back then. Plus, I love that he said the history of the peoples and history of the land. Because, for example, you got the German people, but what are you talking about? Austria? Are you talking about Prussia? Are we talking about the Holy Roman Empire? There's very diverse regions where the German people as a whole have existed, and then you have the story of the land that now we know as Germany.
known for the name given to it by its modern-day nation-state, Turkey. The geographical terms for it are Anatolia or Asia Minor, being Greek for East or Latin for Little Asia. And the story of Anatolia is a story separated into a part before those.
Oh, my camera. My camera, yeah, that might be... Let me just check. Yeah, I get it. I get it now. I know how to fix this. Ah, shit. Should have prepared a little bit better. I'm sorry about this. No, it's not like this. Dude, I hate that this happens, man. But don't you worry, guys. There we go. Yeah, you guys can see me right now. It says Wi-Fi over here. It shouldn't be Wi-Fi. It should be a USB connection. All right. Sorry, I'm so sorry about that, guys. I really apologize. I fucking hate having these types of issues. But yeah, now it should be better. Now the camera shouldn't stutter at all because now it's a USB connection, so it should be really fluid. So, thank you very much. Much love to the US West Coast. Man, I love the US. So great country.
Those currently inhabiting the region, and the story of those who inhabit it now, but also the stories of those that came before those that came before those that inhabit it now, and those that came before them, and those that came before those. Throughout the millennia, many came to claim these lands, mainly claiming it though through one thing, a right to land through conquest, as these lands are extremely valuable and probably one of the most sought after and valuable pieces of real estate in the Mediterranean. Surrounded by mountain ranges on all sides, the central Anatolian plains with its rivers and the downpours from the Mediterranean spill out into vast fertile plains that were ideal for early agricultural-based settlers, such as the Krauts civilization, around 10,000 years ago. The settlers of this region also discovered another enormous advantage of the region, the vast natural resources, specifically important for the first metal age
Nice.
that they would help kickstart, namely the copper ore in the Pontic Mountains. The oldest known copper relics, which are around 10,000 years old, have been found in this region of Anatolia. Through digging up and dating copper relics, we know that this region of the world is the epicenter from which the Copper Age began. Being that copper was the most modern technology of the time, it turned the region into a center for trade and connected its civilization to the southern civilizations of the Halaf culture based in modern-day northern Syria. This trade was made easy through yet another benefit of the Anatolian geography. Anatolia is the origin of the two most important rivers in the Middle East,
The Tigris and
the
the
Euphrates. Copper could be shipped downstream and traded for mirrors, pottery and grain that the succeeding Mesopotamian civilizations had to sell. Cometh the Bronze Age, cometh a new civilization, the Hittites, and the region developed into one of the most prosperous of the ancient world. If the Hittites or Indo-European peoples came to Anatolia as migrants or conquerors is not known.
How do you guys experience this in your countries? Because, for example, in Mexico, like he said at the beginning, it's the history of the land and then history of the people. So most people in Mexico are mixed from Spain and Native American. But you gotta learn the history of the Native American group. So even though I am not Native American myself, or well, I probably have like 10, 20% ancestry, but I have to learn that because that's history of the land, the people that lived here. So I don't know in you guys in your countries, I might imagine that America has a similar thing. Maybe even people in Europe. But how do you guys experience this?
Only know that
and yeah,
they
I
came
agree.
of the Bronze Age
Turkey is
and
one of the
stayed.
most important
Bronze
places
is
in
made
history.
9 parts copper and 1 part of tin, which makes tin a resource in need. Again, this region
the
is
mystery
the
of
epicenter of
tin.
the Bronze Age, yet another metal age. But we do not know where the tin came from. There are large tin deposits in Britain, northern France, Portugal, Spain, Malaysia, and Nigeria, which for their part explain the burgeoning Bronze Age
Pretty random,
civilizations
huh?
in these places wants to know how reach them. But not so much in Anatolia. The origin of the tin used to make bronze in Anatolia is still somewhat of a mystery. Tin, due to its chemical composition, can form into tinstone or cassiterite, which, similar to gold, can form at riverbanks in what are called placers that can be scooped and collected. Our safest bet is that this is how the tin was acquired in the river landscapes of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The bronze made out of that tin and copper brought wealth, but also the Bronze Age collapse, during which the Hittite Empire fell apart into small bickering states to eventually be conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Even though often described as an Assyrian colony, it is far more likely that Anatolia was one of the more important and significant regions of the Assyrian Empire, and not just a foreign place conquered and plundered. A 3,000-year-old ship found off the coast of Uluburn, loaded with dozens of tons of copper, tin, bronze, gold, as well as ivory, point to the significance of Anatolia as an integral part of the Assyrian Empire, as do the various Assyrian artifacts found in Anatolia. Yet as the Hittite Empire declined, someone else also took up shop on the other side of Anatolia. Lydia appeared around 3,000 years ago and took advantage of yet another great geographic benefit of Anatolia, its vast coastline protected by mountains, ideal to go out and trade through the Mediterranean, but with the added benefit of the mountains providing protection from any...
I think this is important because when people, people have used boats for a very long time, but they haven't done such a thorough exploration of the world because ideally, as I understand it, you should sail where you could see land. And the importance of Anatolia, and if we can see the map, is that you have all of these islands. So if you sail around this, you're always going to see some land. So that's why it's an important trading hub at that time, because you could see the land. It's very close, and that's why the Mediterranean is also very important, because it's so close to each other that you could see the land, and you can always see islands, and you're not going to get lost. Therefore, it's not dangerous. Yeah, it definitely looks like that.
Trade through the Mediterranean, but with the added benefit of the mountains providing protection from any potential invasion by sea. Lydia managed to fight off nomadic raiders such as the Scythians and Cimmerians, and access to the Mediterranean brought Lydia under early Greek
We'll find
influence
out, brother.
trade with Egypt,
We'll find out
which
together.
in return allowed it to prosper. Meanwhile, on the other side of Anatolia, the Assyrians collapsed into bickering states at civil war that neglected many provinces of their once great empire, which allowed the nomadic Scythians and Cimmerians to raid its Anatolian lands, and eventually for the Achaemenids to roll in and take it all over. And here we reach a moment where history mixes somewhat with legend and myth. The last king of Lydia, Krauts, visited the Oracle of Delphi asking if he should go to war with the Achaemenids. To which the oracle replied, "If you go to war, a great kingdom shall be destroyed." So Krauts went to war with the Achaemenids, and consequently the kingdom of Lydia was destroyed as the Achaemenids conquered it. However, as much as the Achaemenids must have enjoyed their power over Anatolia, they didn't make it their new home, but a satrapy, where local Greek colonists and city-states increasingly
Sure. It's not only that. I just think it's important, but there's definitely a lot more to it. Some things that I know, and probably some things that I have no idea that we're going to discover. But yeah, I think that the ship technology was one of the factors.
Their Persian overlords, which in return was a perfect justification for the Macedonians to invade the place and kick the Achaemenids out again. This began a long period of Hellenic dominance in Anatolia, however not through a united Greek ruler, but several states, kingdoms and entities, such as the Seleucids, Pontus and Pergamon, who warred and bickered over land and dominance over the landmass. It saw the arrival of the Bithynians in the Bosporan Straits, a Thracian people from modern-day Bulgaria who Hellenized and founded a city and kingdom at a strategically important position. The arrival of the Galatians, who were a Celtic tribe from modern-day Hungary who migrated into Greece, sacked several cities, and then migrated into Anatolia to settle there. There, they would be neighbors to the Cappadocians, an Iranian kingdom in central Anatolia. Combined with an Armenian expansion westward, this shaped Anatolia's cultural makeup for centuries to come as a diverse place.
Yeah, I know, right? He was like, well, I didn't told you which kingdom. I said a kingdom.
Of many different cultures, languages, and people.
You gotta take the
L,
bro.
This multitude of cultures, combined with the strategic importance of the landmass, made especially the coastal regions rich and powerful. Greek kingdoms controlled trade from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Galatian mercenaries served in Egyptian armies, and the Armenian kingdom kept growing. Then came the Romans, who didn't drive anyone away, but simply made everyone become Roman. Under the Romans, the wealth of the region didn't decline but increase. More importantly, as Anatolia could be used as a base of power from which, through rivers and roads, power could be exercised over the Levant, Mesopotamia, and by that extent Egypt, the importance of the province that the Romans named Asia Minor kept growing and growing. In particular, the importance of its biggest city, Bithynia. Financial, political, and military power gradually shifted within the Roman Empire eastwards to Anatolia and the Bosporus Straits. Culturally, this changed the makeup of the Roman Empire in the east. It became more Greek, as the people in the cities were predominantly Greek. It is where the Romans started adopting Christianity, with a distinctive Greek touch to it. After the death of Rome's first Christian empire, the city which he had helped expand as the new capital was named after him, and subsequent emperors divided the empire into two, of which the Eastern Empire would be the only one to remain. As such, it endured further centuries from its capital at the Bosporus, with its heartland in Anatolia, even as it lost much of its empire, first to the Sassanids and then to the first caliphates. Someone, however, who is not to be seen in this, the first years of history of this mass of land, are the people who this video
the
is
Turkic
about.
people.
They spent those years elsewhere, and at around 1200 they were about to make their great entry into this story.
Is he talking about Turkic people? I guess so.
10,000 years ago, our ancestors were all nomads. For the first several 10,000
Amen to
years
that.
of our species'
Absolutely
existence,
interesting.
man and woman
And important.
were wanderers. The discovery of fire, the first to make tool flint.
It's also surprising how long the Roman Empire lasted compared to most civilizations at that time. And a lot of things happened. A lot. And it shaped modern Europe.
And those who painted the vast, beautiful cave paintings in places such as Chauvet in France were people constantly on the move. And move they had to. The protein they relied on for their diet was meat, which is a more concentrated protein than plant food. Eating meat also cuts down the time spent eating by 2/3. But meat is harder to acquire, especially for a slow creature like a human being having to hunt creatures
Damn,
that
we're
are
slow,
adapted
bro.
to fleeing
We
far
suck.
faster predators than men. To
As
be able
nomads,
to
of
hunt
course.
such prey, it requires specialization and collective effort. And it also requires movement, because hunting cannot sustain a growing population at one spot over time.
Yeah.
The extent to which a patch of land can sustain a hunting population is limited by the game being hunted, its cyclical patterns of migration, and that leaves hunters with the very stark choice of either moving with the game or starvation. Early humans didn't become nomads by choice, but because they had no other choice. At around 10,000 BC, something happened that disrupted the nomadic lives of many early humans. The Ice Age ended. And with the change in climate and landscape that reshaped the world's geography, river valleys and vast fertile plains capable of sustaining agriculture formed that invited these early people in to settle. However, in free regions of the world, geography still lent itself to the life of the nomad. The plains of North America, the savannas of Africa, and the vast steppes of Asia. As people settled in the Fertile Crescent,
Human
the
nomads
Nile
are
Valley,
OP.
the Indus River Valley, and the Yellow River Valley, the peoples of the steppe had no place to settle. The agricultural revolution of 10,000 BC also brought a new addition that affected the lives of nomads as well, the domestication of animals. Reindeer, goats, and sheep domesticated changed the nomad life from hunter-gatherers to herders. Through this, the nomads took upon themselves the responsibility of nature. Providing food for the herded animals required the nomads to continue traveling in search of pastures to graze. A nomad's life is a harsh and
I'm gonna have a
unforgiving
snack.
life.
Guys, if you don't mind, some cheese Pringles. By the way, look at the seals that the Mexican food have. Basically telling you that you're gonna die if you eat this kind of stuff.
Life is an endless ritual revolving around the animals. The horses, the sheep, the dogs, the goats take center stage in life and community. A tribe's value and strength are measured by its animals. Constant moving and dedication to survival leave little room for specialization, as all specialization is dedicated to the herd and the tribe. Survival requires a simple life as a nomad. Within settled civilizations, the surplus in food allowed for a surplus in labor pool who could specialize in masonry, metalwork, writing, governance, and more. However, specializations within settled communities have disadvantages compared to nomadic civilizations. A farmer is specialized to be a farmer, a mason is specialized to be a mason, neither are warriors. In comparison, a nomad will always be a herder, a hunter, and a warrior at the same time. Civilization also comes with civilization diseases, which most nomads avoid, resulting in longer average life.
What was that?
Civilization diseases, which
What the hell is that, bro? I'm not gonna ask, you know?
most nomads avoid, resulting in longer average life expectancy for a nomadic culture. And in that position, a nomad can also acquire technologies of settled peoples by simply taking them or trading them. One of the largest geographic landscapes in the world are the Eurasian steppes. They stretch out from the Balkans to the Pacific coast over a total of over 4,000 miles.
The birth
in
of
length
great
and up to
nomad
1,000
civilizations.
miles wide. This vast landscape is almost in its entirety flat, grassy plains, stretching out endlessly into the horizon, dotted with a few deserts and hills. Only a few mountains and lakes pierce through this endless landscape. There are no rivers to
smallpox.
settle on,
Oh, right.
no large fertile fields to irrigate, no mountains to build borders around, no boulders to make walls with, and no forests to log and build with. So the people who inhabited these lands remained nomadic as most others settled. And who these people were is somewhat hard to define. People are different from animals in that we don't just leave behind what we were when we die, but also what we made. And with nomads, there is not much being left behind. No buildings, walls, or castles. To nomadic peoples, everything is always used, nothing is wasted, and therefore almost nothing is left behind. The best an archaeologist can hope for are burial mounds, and what we find in them may contradict stereotypes that you may have of the supposedly scruffy poor nomad. The armor of the Golden Warrior can be seen in the Kazakhstan National Museum and was presumably worn by a Scythian warrior 2,400 years ago. From Kazakhstan to Ukraine to Russia to Mongolia, what we find proves considerable wealth and fortunes belonged to the tribes inhabiting these lands. But we also find arrowheads and helmets made of bronze and other materials. Metalwork, however, is a specialization that nomads don't have access to.
Yeah, I was one of those guys who believed that nomads were poor, or it just like, I don't want to say less developed civilizations, but that like definitely less advantaged, right? But well, I was just...
Which shows to us
apparently
that
they weren't.
Such either through trade, tribute, or force. Beyond the physical
Bro, they were
evidence
balling
found in
100%,
burial
man.
It is possible to draw a map with borders detailing which nomadic tribe lived where in which parcel of these vast lands. However, for a people constantly on the move, owning land makes no sense. The idea of a border also makes no sense. The only border a nomad knows is an ocean a horse can't ride, a jungle a horse can't cross.
I mean, also, this is also the story for many North American native tribes. There were also many nomads, and if you look at places like Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, these are all very flat places as well. And many of the native civilizations there were nomad, including places like northern Mexico as well, which differs from the Aztecs that they settled on central Mexico because it's just a really nice valley, it has rivers and stuff.
The horse won't survive in, and the mountain a horse can't jump over. And because of this, when speaking of nomads, the idea of a people or nation in our sense doesn't make sense. Nomads see themselves more in terms of families and clans, and in such structures, interactions between tribes of differing cultures are also different. A conquered people are not subjugated, enslaved, or slaughtered, but simply made part of the tribe and the extended family. Marriages across cultures are more common and widespread than in settled civilizations.
Oh, wow.
You can have a geographic estimate of where which tribe and people were active, but those estimates are often based on accounts
Interracial
by
marriage
victims of
before it was
raids.
popular.
Through that, we can place the Scythians, for example, in the land stretching from Ukraine through the Caucasus to northern Iran, as these tribes raided and plundered Greeks, Thracians, and Iranians, who then wrote about them. But these are not to be understood as lands in the modern sense with borders, but more as a sphere of influence within which the Scythians were active. For the vast enormous steppes themselves, it is difficult to determine who was where, at what point, for how long. What we do know is that there were many. The Scythians, the Proto-Iranian Scythians, also known as the Sarmatians, the Proto-Slavic tribes, the Finno-Ugric tribes, the Proto-Mongols, and up there in the easternmost fringes of Siberia and northern China, we find where the Proto-Turkic people probably came from.
Okay.
And we know of them from this place because some of them still live there, still as nomads and still worshipping the ancient nature gods, and because they raided the Chinese, who then wrote about them. And what the Chinese had to write about these early proto-Turkic peoples wasn't very flattering. Then again, the ancient Chinese didn't have much nice to say about anyone besides them.
By both the Romans and the Chinese called like foreigners barbarians, which is interesting.
Themselves. Based around the Altai Mountains in various confederations of tribes, these proto-Turkic tribes would raid Chinese towns.
Did the Huns brought Rome to its knees? Man, I really should learn more. If you guys have any sort of good books or good documentaries even, like, totally leave it in the comments.
And castles. But we also encounter a problem through these Chinese sources. The exact ethnic makeup of the tribes they encountered is somewhat unclear. The large steppe regions east of the Altai Mountains were not just home to the Proto-Turkic, but also to the Proto-Mongol tribes. It is therefore sometimes unclear if a tribe or confederation of tribes that the Chinese historians describe were Turkic or Mongol, since ancient Chinese historians made no distinction and just called
they're all barbarians.
One of the first large nomadic confederations of the region was the Xianbei, and since the debate over if they were Mongol, Turkic or a confederation of both is heated and the answer unknown, I won't be trying to answer it here. The Xianbei were overthrown by the Rouran Khaganate, of which it isn't entirely clear if they were Turkic or Mongol, but it is more likely that they were Mongol. To the north of the Rouran Khaganate there was however a tribal confederation which we know was Turkic, the Xiongnu, and it is through them that the peoples of Europe and the Middle East had their first encounters with Turkic peoples when some of them migrated west in late 400, where they were called the Huns. This was the first large-scale invasion by nomadic people of Europe, and it instantly revealed the weaknesses of the type of warfare that the settled kingdoms practiced. Plate armor, heavy chainmail, tight formations, heavy weapons and slow-moving military tactics were absolutely no match to the swift, fast-moving horse archers in light leather armor. The Huns also introduced the Romans to the recurve bow. This is as simple a technology as a bow bent backward, which increases the tension on the bowstring, allowing the arrows to be shot with more power and speed, which caused the arrows to simply punch through Roman armors, chainmail and shields with close to no effort. This bow was the result of the nomadic specific specializations required to improve a herd society's
They did
life.
brought Rome to its knees. Wow.
Hunnic tribes invaded Europe, Iran and northern India and caused the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. However, after defeating their enemies and acquiring vast empires of tributary states, a weakness in the nomad life was exposed. After conquering a settled people, a nomad cannot simply remain a nomad anymore. A settled people cannot simply be integrated into a tribe or family like a different nomadic tribe. And consequently the nomads are trapped into consistently patrolling a hostile land, worked by a people who increasingly despise their overlords. The Hunnic Empire stretched from the North Sea to the Caspian, but after barely half a century they were driven out by the people they had subjugated. However, as the Hunnic Empire collapsed into itself, the 5th century started with a flood of nomadic peoples invading and migrating into settled lands. The Bulgars, Avars, Slavs, Finno-Ugurs and the Hungarians came from the Eurasian steppe into Europe throughout the next 4 centuries. But unlike the Huns that preceded them, they all settled and transformed from nomadic peoples into settled kingdoms. And during that time, on the other end of the Eurasian continent, an interesting development was happening. The Rouran Khaganate collapsed and was replaced by the Turkic
nightmares
Khaganate, also
for
known
Europe,
as the
for the
Gökturks.
Roman Empire.
After defeating the Rouran Khaganate, the Gökturks would defeat the Iranian Hephletites and
the
consolidate
Gökturks,
power over almost the entire Eurasian steppe. From there, they would continuously launch raids against China and Persia, and it is possible that their
China has been having problems with nomadic tribes since like forever, man.
Conquest of the Eurasian steppes is what caused the great migrations of people into Europe as refugees from the Gökturks. However, by 600, their empire had split into two between a West and an East Khanate. The Eastern Khaganate would spend its history almost constantly raiding Tang dynasty China until it fell to the Turkic Uyghur Khaganate, which itself fell apart into various smaller Khaganates. The Western Gökturk Khanate also fell apart into various smaller Khanates and tribes, and amongst them, one would stand out and do something that no Turkic tribe had done before.
They would settle.
The Tatars were Turkic peoples originating in Central Asia, and one of their tribes, during the expansion of the Göktürk Empire and its collapse, settled at the Aral Sea, expanded south into modern-day Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, where they gave up being nomads and converted to Islam. The Seljuks. They became great admirers of their new neighbors, the Samanid Empire of Iran. It was the Samanids who converted the Seljuks to Islam. The Seljuks became increasingly fond of their new Iranian neighbors. They started dressing like their Iranian idols. Seljuk nobility started speaking Persian. They adopted the Persian alphabet, minted Persian coins, built castles in Persian style, copied the Samanids wherever they could, and even formed a military
fans, bro.
alliance
They were
with them.
all in.
Then the Samanids were overthrown by the Ghaznavids, which the Seljuks disapproved of, especially after the Ghaznavids tried to conquer them. So
Do they
the
still
Seljuks
have
conquered
problems
them
with the
right
Mongols?
back. And that became a watershed moment. Suddenly, they
That's funny, bro.
were the rulers of Persia. They, who had started as nomadic herders a few hundred years before, now were the inheritors and the heirs to the great legacy of Iran and all that came with it. Through this, their culture and the way they saw themselves radically changed, and with that, Turkic culture itself changed dramatically. At the time, the Seljuks were probably in the minority amongst the Turkic peoples, as having given up nomadic life and converted to Islam and becoming a settled people. But over the centuries, their influence through their empire would spread into creating a Turkish cultural sphere that stretched from China to the Crimea.
Yeah, I also had that idea that it didn't fall to the Huns. Like, was it Germanic tribes, Celtic tribes? Can't really remember. I'm not a huge fan of ancient. Well, I am a fan, but I just haven't had the time to read more about ancient history. But you guys can tell me.
As the Seljuks were sitting in their new Persian home, they boarded
You guys
someone
are smart,
new,
man.
Baghdad, the capital of the once great First Islamic Caliphate,
The Islamic
center of
Golden
knowledge
Age.
and trade in the Middle East, one of the greatest jewels a medieval empire could own, held by the Buyids, who happened to be Shia Muslims. So the Sunni Abbasids gave them the permission to conquer it. This moved the Seljuks into the center of the Islamic world, and with this, they boarded yet another prize, the greatest they had seen until then. That last remaining piece of the Roman Empire,
Constantinople,
Anatolia,
man.
the Byzantines. And that prize no longer got out of their heads. Rome, one of the greatest empires of all time, the founders of European civilization, the pinnacle of what an empire could be. The Seljuks changed their imperial seal and battle banners to the double-headed eagle of Rome. They started calling themselves the inheritors and legitimate rulers of the Roman Empire and went to war, because there could in the end only be one Roman Empire. It went well at first. The Byzantines had recently declared the Armenians to be heretics to the Christian faith, so the Armenians didn't put up much of a fight when the Seljuks came to take the Byzantine Caucasian lands. From there on, they marched into Anatolia. They fought off and defeated 2 crusades called to defeat them. They lost Iran to a Persian uprising, but Anatolia continued to be their main prize. They came within miles of the great prize of Constantinople itself, but events that they could have never foreseen, in the very place they themselves had come from 3,000 miles away.
Yeah, I agree. Let's get this settled. I do think that, like all complex historical events, it's a mixture of facts, and I do think that probably the Hun invasions debilitated Rome a lot.
Prevented their final triumph. As in the steppes of Asia, 600 years of Turkic dominance came to an end. It took the Turkic people 600 years to migrate into Central Asia and expand from Central Asia into Persia and the Middle East and eventually into Anatolia. The Mongols only needed 40 years to conquer it all, as well as China. After defeat to the Mongols, they needed 40 years to conquer it all,
looking at a map
as
like
well
this.
as China. After defeat to the Mongols, the Seljuks needed 40 years to conquer it
This is insane.
all, as well as China. After defeat to the Mongols, the Seljuks fell apart into bickering little fiefdoms and states who all bowed to the Mongols. But far from this being the end of the story, it is merely the start of the next great chapter.
The heirs of Rome. Okay, here we go.
Over the centuries, from
Buckle up,
600
boys.
to 1200, the Turkic expansion created a vast Turkic cultural sphere of many a Turkic people. It stretched from Siberia to Anatolia, and as the Mongols emerged from the vast horde lands of the east, their conquest of Asia didn't just result in a mere subjugation of Turkic tribes and kingdoms, but in massive migration of Turkic peoples. From Central Asia to Persia and the Caucasus, many Turkic peoples packed and fled in search of refuge, and they mostly ended up in the lands of the Seljuks, thereby establishing a large Turkish population in Anatolia. The Seljuks themselves fell to the Mongols, and the 1300s
You can
were
run, but you
dominated by
can't
the
hide.
Taifas, little petty kingdoms, warlords, and tribes that bickered and fought amongst themselves for control over the others and dominance. But they had a great advantage compared to the others defeated by the Mongols: the Zagros mountain range. Stretching from the Caucasus to the Gulf, this vast range of mountains protects whoever rules Iran, but it also locks them into Iran, making it hard to sally forth into the Middle East or Anatolia. And at a certain point it was simply no longer worthwhile to launch large expeditions to ensure the Anatolian Turks stayed in line. The most powerful of them was the Rum Sultanate, the successors to the Seljuk throne. One of the least powerful was a little state whose rulers originally came from Central Asia and had fled west from the Mongols: the Ottomans. While much of the Middle East had been flung into chaos through the Mongol invasion, the Ottomans
Damn.
managed to build a sphere of stability in their realm. This attracted craftsmen, intellectuals, and trade, while also providing the Ottomans with the stability required to go out and hassle others. Those others mainly being the Byzantines. But the Ottomans didn't just go charge into war as the Seljuks had. And of course they went through spats of conquest here and then, but the Ottomans mainly subdued the Byzantines through diplomacy, politics, and patience. They married
Slowly,
Byzantine princesses,
yeah.
schemed within the politics of the Byzantine royal court, promised the Byzantines support against the Bulgars, Venetians, and Serbs, but used those promises to just take lands previously owned by the Byzantines, then conquered by others, and to not give them back. By the turn of the century, the Ottomans had established a firm grip over the Balkans and Western Anatolia, and that gave them an enormous strategic advantage over the other caliphates and the Seljuks and everyone
Alright,
else.
guys, I am so sorry to be doing this, but I'm gonna have a real quick cut. I need to go for some ice, man. So, I'm gonna be right back. I'll be right back. Like 1 minute, probably less than that. All right, so we are back. Sorry, guys, you can call this a whiskey stop. Everybody's gangsta until the Ottomans come. Amen to that, bro. Just a little whiskey stop. And yes, I'm gonna be drinking Red Label, okay? I know it's cheap, but you can't always drink the expensive stuff. And it's not that bad. I mean, a lot of people shit on this whiskey, but like it's not bad whiskey though. Not at all. Johnny Walker definitely knows how to do its stuff. By the way, let's continue. Oh shit.
who had come before them from the Middle East and Iran and attempted to conquer the Mediterranean. Access to the resources of these lands would further Ottoman conquest for more power elsewhere. It gave them a place of some tranquility as the Mongol hordes invaded Anatolia again. But to understand the complete significance, we have to look at maps and ships. Seafaring was extremely dangerous for most of human history and mostly involved coast hopping. You would sail along the coastline, always
Hey, we
in
talked
sight
about
of
this
said
at the beginning.
coastline, and at all costs avoid the open ocean as much as you possibly could. The means to navigate the vast open seas were simply not available, and getting lost out of sight of the coast was tantamount to a death sentence. This, of course, cancelled out most of the Atlantic as any means of transportation by sea, but transport by sea was still faster and more efficient than transport by land, so it was still worth the risk heading out and hopping along the coastline. The Mediterranean, however, was different. It was mostly calm, but far more important, it had peninsulas, lots of peninsulas, all over the place. And when you look at these maps, it is also useful to forget the current geopolitical boundaries and borders. 1,000 years ago, the concept of Europe as a uniform entity of some shared culture or values would have made no sense.
Exactly.
What, however, would have made sense would have been to categorize the region around the Mediterranean as its own entity, a kind of Mediterranean sphere of culture and influence. People in the Levant would have had more interactions with people in Sicily than people in Sicily would have had with people from the North Sea. Add to that the Egyptian breadbasket, and you have a region that many empires came to try and
This is
rule
now a
for
very
themselves,
political statement.
especially in these regions: the Adriatic, the Aegean, the Black Sea, and in particular the Dardanelles. In these waters, it is close to impossible to get lost at sea. Almost like lakes, no matter where you head, you will almost certainly, at some point, hit land in close vicinity. This means that you didn't need to hop along the coastline as much, and that you could tax, police, and control all traffic going through these segments of ocean. This allowed for specialization in nautical transport and warfare, and consequently it should not surprise you that prior to the 16th century, most European and Middle Eastern empires happened to be those who controlled those straits. This is a great springboard to go out and conquer the rest of the Mediterranean.
Amen to that.
And what about the Mediterranean? What makes it so special? It is again the fact that ocean travel was limited to coast hopping. To the people of the time, the oceans were vast, deep pits of certain death. Siberia was empty horde lands with close to no means of large-scale transportation. So if you owned the eastern Mediterranean, you controlled all trade between west and east, be it the spices from India or silk from China. All of it had to go through the eastern Mediterranean. And if you controlled that, you could tax it. Before the 17th century, the geography of the eastern Mediterranean was geography that made its owners superpowers. Then there's also the breadbasket, specifically Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both these regions have the benefit of the most fertile lands in the region combined with a mild climate. This consistently produced the regular surplus in grain, which in return could feed vast empires, while most lands elsewhere had to consistently face regular famines due to crop failures and other agricultural disadvantages. Those who owned Egypt could guarantee a regular, not just supply, but a surplus of food for its own population, allowing them to focus their attention elsewhere and expand. As much as we like to think of the Ottomans as a historical entity that represents an Islamic force trying to conquer Europe, the reality of the matter is that the Ottomans mainly pursued rule over the Mediterranean, because most powers before them had done so as well, and because of the enormous geopolitical value of the Mediterranean before the 1700s. And the first step to controlling the Mediterranean was completed by the 1450s, when the Ottomans ended the Byzantines and controlled most of the Balkans, Marmara, the Bosporus, and the Aegean coastline. The Ottomans made Constantinople their new capital and transformed the city dramatically. Under the Byzantines, the city had stretched along the southern end of the Golden Horn. Under the Ottomans, over the next 2 centuries, the city expanded into all directions to include the entire Golden Horn and both sides of the Bosporan Straits.
The fall of Constantinople, probably, at least in my view, top 10 historical events when it comes to like the most important for history. And I think I've heard a lot of Christians that are really salty about this. I don't know. I've heard some very weird comments about the whole thing. Yeah, the last surviving bit of the Roman Empire. But hey, what was the date? 14 something? Like late 1400s? again, huge institution, the Roman Empire.
City would come to dominate international trade for the next 200 years, and also would be the harbor from which an enormous Ottoman fleet would try to conquer and control the Mediterranean. Beginning what we now know as the era of transformation. That massive navy helped conquer the Black Sea coastline and Crimea, as well as solidify Ottoman control over Greece. Meanwhile, in the south, Egypt and the Levant had been ruled by the Mamelukes, an incompetent series of squabbling dynasties that were unable to put up much resistance to an Ottoman conquest of their
1453,
lands, which
right.
then pushed further to conquer North Africa, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, from
Man,
where
look
the
at
last of the Abbasid caliphs was dragged to Istanbul to abdicate the title of caliph to the Ottoman Sultan. With that done,
Wow, just think about that. You're dragging the old religious leader to your capital to surrender the title of caliph. That's an important caliph, an important title. It's like the Orthodox Christians taking the Pope somewhere to surrender the title of Pope. I guess, is that a correct assessment? What do you guys think?
were now the center of the Islamic world. They controlled and taxed all Silk Road trade to Europe, had the largest navy in the Mediterranean, and they had access to the Indian Ocean, which they would also try to control.
They were
But
a
there's
powerhouse,
something
bro.
important which we might be missing here. People tend to live in a society. We can look at
They
maps
were
and economics
truly
as much
balling.
as we want, but fundamentally an empire or nation-state construct of any sort is always a society, and without a coherent social fabric holding it all together, societies tend to collapse into themselves. So what was this Ottoman society like? And how did the social fabric of this society keep such a large and diverse empire together for 400 years? The reason is because at the time, it was one of the few empires that actually had a social structure that could sustain an empire. It tolerated differences. It is easy to forget that before the 1900s, Anatolia's population was 1/3 non-Muslim. In general, there were
Oh,
times
whoa.
at which this Islamic caliphate had a larger Christian population than the Muslim population. On average, Greeks living in the Ottoman Empire were wealthier than the average Turks, because the Greeks had built a large network of trade over centuries that the Ottomans didn't just take from them, but just taxed. Armenian craftsmen helped build the Ottoman navy and their new expanded capital, Istanbul.
I agree
And
with
the reason
that,
for this
Abysmal.
is because under the Islamic laws, which were the laws of the empire, all these groups were tolerated. We also have to keep in mind that in that time, group identities barely ever exceeded across the borders and limitations of the village that a person resided in. A concept such as a nationalistic tribal identity built on grounds of language or ethnicity wasn't prevalent. And people to an empire are first and foremost one thing, a resource, probably the most valuable resource there is. And the Ottomans were one of the few empires of the time who understood that and welcomed that resource wherever they could receive it. When Spain expelled its Jews, it was the Ottomans who jumped in to welcome them. And that tolerance that made life in a religious hierarchy possible gave the Ottomans enormous advantages over their contemporaries. Arab caliphates, in comparison, tended to overly stigmatize non-Muslim groups, enforced Arab tribal structures over subjects, and were regularly subjected to anti-Jewish programs and expulsions. Europe was at that time consumed by religious hatred. If you were Catholic, living in Protestant lands was not a good idea, neither was the reverse. The resulting conflicts bogged Europe down into massive bloodlettings such as the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War that stifled innovation and expansion. While within the Ottoman Empire, differing religious groups were tolerated, and this gave the Ottomans an enormous benefit in building and sustaining internal stability, but to also take advantage of external conflict. When the Ottomans, for example, marched on Vienna, they were joined and supported by Hungarian Protestants, who no longer wished to live under Austrian Catholic Habsburg rule. On a side note, there's an Austrian racial slur for Hungarians that developed out of this historic event, Turken, which means cross-carrying Turks. But it would be
dropped the
unwise, as
K
many
word.
unfortunately do today, to see this as a glorified, tolerant Islamic past. For one, and probably most importantly,
By the way, he knows
there's
because
a
he's
big
from
difference
Austria.
between being tolerated and having rights as a person. The main difference being that one of them is a long list of guarantees to you as a person for your safety, life, and well-being. The other is a list of all the things you cannot do, mostly dictated by a majority to an oppressed minority. The tolerance under the Ottomans, from our modern lens, was preferable to the intolerance of its neighbors, but it was just that, a condescending tolerance.
Yeah, I totally get what he's saying. He's basically saying, In Europe, if you were a Catholic in Protestant land, you could have get killed. If you were a Jew in Ottoman lands, you wouldn't. So that's better than the latter, but that's not necessarily great.
Under Sharia law, a
So
non-Muslim
probably
is
this
a
is gonna
lesser
come
being.
up
A non-Muslim
later.
pays special taxes, has no access to legal protections that Muslims may have. His testimony against a Muslim will always be rejected in courts, which
Oh.
by extension means Muslims have a free hand to commit crimes against non-Muslims without facing any consequences. Non-Muslims are forbidden from owning a means of transportation, are forbidden from building new
God.
houses of worship, were forbidden from publicly practicing their faith, and lived in segregated ghettos. From our modern lens,
So yeah, it
this
kinda
is
sucked.
unacceptable. But even this discriminatory standard of living was preferable over the chaos and madness of Europe at the time, where worshipping the wrong god simply got you burned alive. If you were to travel back through time into the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power, calling the first official you encountered a Turk or even an Ottoman would have earned you a weird look, and the response, "You are in the Roman Empire," as that is what the empire saw itself as. After taking Constantinople, they proclaimed themselves to be the legitimate heirs of the Roman Empire. This was also a society of multiple languages, from Turkish to Persian to Arabic
Greek.
to Armenian, Greek and Hebrew. And languages were also separated by class, not only within the Islamic religious hierarchy, but by social status. Few people outside of the Ottoman Arab lands spoke Arabic. The language was reserved to be the language of religion and the mosque. The commoners spoke Turkish, but the Sultan, the royal family, and the royal court all spoke Persian, as they had held on to the court traditions and practices of the Seljuks, and also saw themselves as the legitimate rulers
Seljuks
of
were
Iran,
fan of the
which leads
Persians.
us to another often overlooked fact. We like to often think of the Ottomans as the great rivals of Russia or the Habsburgs, but the reality is that they mostly fought their wars with dynasties ruling Iran,
Persia,
as they
yeah.
wished to incorporate Iran into their empire. The Ottoman transformation period lasted for 2 centuries, throughout which it was at the height of its reach and the predominant power of the hemisphere. But as we all know, that empire came to gradually, over the course of its remaining 2 centuries, to collapse into itself.
The beginning of the end. Shit, my dude.
It is often somewhat hard to deduct and find the reason for why an empire collapses. First
Yo,
and foremost,
it's
it is
15
something that
viewers.
is in our day and age
Congratulations
very easily
to us
exploited
all.
for very cheap political nonsense shots.
Let's just appreciate that he's parodying what's the name of the channel? Black Pigeon something? Yeah, basically a right winger. That he basically says the West is dying. Which
The
I
Roman
don't
Empire is
agree.
a great example of this. I am sure many of you have seen that Michael Moore movie, where he draws comparisons between the supposed decadence of the late Roman Empire and the United States.
And America,
Or
yeah.
some
Oh, bro, I
drooling
hate it.
right-wing
Yeah.
YouTuber claiming immigration caused the Roman Empire to collapse. However, when the Roman Empire collapsed, it was at the height of Christianity's power in the empire, when most of the things we consider to be decadent had been abolished. And the Romans purposefully sought out the conquest and settling of foreign peoples who they could then use as a resource. The list of reasons for why this empire collapsed is immensely long, and many of these reasons are often
One of the
overlooked
only
by
times there
hacks
was
who
peace
seek
in the
to
Middle
make
East.
cheap political points. By
Amen.
the 3rd century, the wealthiest Romans had basically stopped paying taxes, which made paying large armies to patrol the borders close to impossible. There is the in a previous chapter mentioned recurve bow, the fact that the Romans offered the Goths lands as vassals in exchange for an alliance against the Huns, and after defeating the Huns, betrayed that promise, to which the Goths reacted by pillaging Roman lands. The fact that the
We were
Eastern
talking
Roman
about
Emperor
this.
Theodosius invaded and sacked the West because it tolerated non-Christians and even appointed them as senators, a war from which the West barely recovered. This leads us to one of the most overlooked reasons, the increasing fanaticism of the Roman Christian churches, which in the final century of Rome's existence persecuted non-Christians and made such incredibly wise decisions as declaring bathing, and by that extent personal hygiene, to be a satanic ritual.
Oh my
I
God.
wonder where all those late Roman plagues came from. In summary, there's a long list of
Yo,
reasons
what the
for
fuck?
why some nations fail, and some of these reasons are unfortunately easily abused, and others easily overlooked. History is never simple, and the reason for why historic events happen are also often never simple. When it comes to the Ottoman Empire in popular
I agree.
history, the moment mostly used as the supposed beginning of the decline is the failed siege of Vienna. But that is really not the moment to realistically choose. This was an extraordinary event, one of the few moments where European states that usually were enemies were able to unite in a common cause. So it makes for a nice story, something that sounds nice and appeals to visions that people may have of the past and present as civilizational struggles between vague concepts of cultures. But it leaves out a fundamental fact, which is that even after this defeat, the Ottoman Empire was still at the peak of its strength and would remain a powerhouse for almost 2 more centuries. Let me instead posit to you 3 alternative reasons for why the Ottoman Empire declined.
Oh, shit, alright.
Geographic, and social. The compass, the cross staff, and the carvel. The compass helped you know where you were going. The cross staff helped you figure out where you are. And the carvel was a way to build a ship that allowed it to go faster.
Alright, so I think I know where he's gonna go with this. Basically, with all these inventions, people were able to explore. The age of exploration, literally, it's called. So now the Anatolia Peninsula became sort of less vital, and of course, less trade, less taxes, less money, less power.
And deep into the oceans.
People could
Suddenly,
sail, people could
those
go to the
vast
Americas,
bits of
they could go to
certain
India,
doom
they
and
could
death
round the
turned
Cape.
into free highways, and those highways led to new lands, which in their turn brought something new to Europe. The potato, the tomato, and corn. These new cash crops.
It's
were not as
complicated, yeah, it's
frail
not
and
simple.
vulnerable as wheat. The Europeans suddenly had their own bread baskets that could sustain a surplus in food, and the technological advances
Spain
in
had
deep water
Mexico.
navigation also impacted geography, not physically, but its usefulness. If you wanted to buy Chinese silk or Indian spices, you
had to go
pay
through
the
Turkey.
tariff set by the Chinese, Mughals, Safavids, Ottomans, and Venetians. These products ended up being luxuries due to the resulting large price tag, and the Ottomans controlled that trade route, so a lot of the money went to them. Then the Portuguese simply sailed around Africa and them, cutting out all the middlemen and bringing vast fortunes.
Yep.
The strategic importance of the Mediterranean, which had helped the Ottomans so much, was suddenly a trap. Now they were closed in and limited by that small ocean and couldn't break out into the open oceans. This brings us to a battle and a war which I believe were more significant than the siege of Vienna. For the Ottomans to break out of the Mediterranean, they would have to conquer and control the entire Mediterranean. So they went to war with Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and Spain, and were shattered at the Battle of Lepanto, where the recently developed new naval
Hey, you called it.
technologies
You called it,
proved their
Abysmal.
worth. The massive and powerful Ottoman navy that had controlled the Mediterranean for centuries consisted of rowing galleons, meant to board enemy vessels and fight hand to hand. Spain sailed in with cannon-laden sailing galleons that laid waste to the outdated Ottoman navy. Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean was thereby broken, and they were restricted to a sphere of influence around the easternmost parts of the Mediterranean. Another path to break out was through the Gulf into trying to dominate and seize control of the Indian Ocean. This resulted in a 20-year war with the Portuguese-Ethiopian alliance, which the Ottomans lost.
Wow.
Trapped by the limitations
Talk
of
about
their
a weird
geography and
alliance.
technology, the Ottomans became prisoners of their own empire, unable to expand beyond its limitations. But there's also a social change which contributed to eventually undermining the Ottoman Empire. This is St. Hedwig's Cathedral in Berlin. It's just one of many cathedrals all across many European cities, but this one is somewhat special. Starting construction under Frederick II of Prussia, intent as being a temple for all religions to share as a common house of worship, it would be the first Catholic cathedral in a Protestant land. Gradually, after a few centuries of slaughtering each other over who was worshipping the right god, Europeans realized that this was silly, and instead found other silly reasons to slaughter each other. But the extreme religious intolerance that had existed in prior centuries started to gradually wither away. The Ottomans thereby started losing their monopoly on tolerance. In 1774 came a massive hit to the Ottoman prestige when they were defeated by the Russians in war. The Russians annexed Ottoman lands in the Ukraine and the Crimea. But there's an often overlooked part of this war that arguably might have done even more damage. The peace agreement included a clause that assigned and guaranteed to Russia the role of being the protector of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. And by that extent, since the Ottoman Sultan was also the Caliph, Russia was the protector of Christianity in the entire Islamic world. If you were a Christian in the Ottoman Empire, you were suddenly not only able to find...
Yeah, let's think about this for a second. This means that basically, if Turkey, well, the Ottoman Empire, did anything slightly against Christians in Europe, then Russia would feel like they have a right to invade, because on their eyes, they're the protectors of all Christians, which was settled on the peace agreement. So this was a terrible, terrible deal.
the same degree of condescending tolerance abroad, but you now had nations abroad that took a vested supposed interest in your well-being, who stood up for you against your overlord in case said overlord may act capriciously against you, or at least on the surface. In reality, this clause was more of a crowbar with which Russia could insert itself into Ottoman affairs as a justification for future wars. Nonetheless, this started changing minds. Why should I pay more taxes, be denied equal legal protection, and live my life being constantly degraded as a heretic to a dominant faith? And the final nail in the coffin of the Ottoman social structure came from France, when the French beheaded their king,
the revolution,
and declared the emancipation of the Jews, with proclaiming that all men were equal, that all had inherent equal rights and liberties no matter their background, ethnicity, faith, or lack thereof. There is a difference between being tolerated and having rights, and with this event, the Ottoman Islamic social structures turned to many into an outdated relic of the past.
The sick man of Europe.
When Tsar Peter I of Russia, also known as the Great, died in 1725, he left behind a...
By the way, look at them eyes. Looks like one of them is blue and one of them is sort of brownish, or what's the name of this color? Between brown and green.
Testament,
which there are people that have this.
Before him. It was meant to be shown not just to his direct successor, but to be read by each and every single Tsar or Tsarina after him the moment they ascended to the throne. It wasn't something that
Nicholas,
he had left behind
the last
for them,
Tsar,
but a simple instruction. Go and conquer Constantinople. The 1800s were a century of imperial expansion and nationalist separatism. Powerful states and ideas would equally come down on the Ottomans with intense pressure. And even though they would try to reform
Here
and
comes
revive
Russia.
their dying empire, they would find themselves unable to avert disaster. The ideas which the French Revolution had spawned of men as equals, a people's right to self-determination, as well as nationalism, came to be the first thing to bite the Ottomans when the Greeks rebelled during their revolution of the 1820s. Foreign interests, however, also played a role in this. The Greeks were initially losing their revolution until foreign powers saw use in a weakened Ottoman Empire and sent their fleets to help the Greeks achieve victory. This was the tipping point. For the first time, a people under Ottoman rule had risen in revolt against its imperial overlords and won their independence. It showed to all the others what was possible. It showed the Europeans that they could expand their influence over the Ottoman Empire by supporting separatism. It showed the Arabs that their overlords were weaker than expected and beatable. Until this moment, the Ottomans might have even still had a chance to turn things around and possibly avoid a total collapse. But from this moment on, it became unavoidable. The Greek Revolution was one of the biggest, if not the biggest nail in the Ottoman coffin. It would form the basis of a new Greek national identity, form the basis of conflict and antagonism that would last to this very day. And from the first Greek day of independence onward, the Ottomans would huddle from one disaster into another. The first to take advantage were the French, who invaded Ottoman Algeria 2 years after Greek independence and made it a colonial province of the French Empire. Also 2 years after Greek independence, the Egyptians revolted, took Jerusalem and Damascus, and gained great autonomy. The Ottomans had to get the British for help to regain control over the Levant, but the British would only do so in exchange for Cyprus. Both had to recognize Egyptian autonomy, marking the first time in centuries that an Arab nation asserted itself again on the world stage, with a ruler intent on modernizing and building a modern Arab monarchy. However, we don't know how that would have gone, as Britain took advantage of this fledgling little new state by occupying it, and Egypt was thereby forced into another empire. 2 years before the end of the Greek Revolution, the Ottomans, in an attempt to clamp down and gain more control over their European lands, cracked down on the Bektashi Muslims of Albania. which resulted in a decade of continuous Albanian uprisings. In 1931, Bosnian Muslim landlords rebelled against land reform. The uprising was brutally crushed, and in an attempt to solve the problem, the Ottomans split the lands up into new administrative sections, giving some of it to their Serbian vassals, which created new problems that themselves kept continuously creating new problems to this day. The Serbs themselves kept having uprisings, and so did the Macedonians, the Montenegrins, the Bulgarians, and the Greeks, who were still under Ottoman rule. All this turmoil and chaos convinced
Turks fighting
outsiders that this
Greeks.
place was falling apart and up for grabs. It also fell into a time of greater Russian imperial ambitions under a growing nationalist pan-Slavic movement, a movement that dreamed of a greater Slavic empire, who referred to Istanbul not as Constantinople, but as Zarengrad, a future capital for such an empire, proclaiming that the turmoil was proof that the Ottomans were mistreating their Christians and referring to the previously mentioned treaty that gave them the role as the guarantor of safety and protector of Christians in the Islamic world. The Russians invaded in 1854 during what became known as the Crimean War, and it seemed like the Ottomans were in for the next big disaster, possibly even the final one. However, the Russians may have been correct about the Ottomans falling apart, but they had gotten greedy, and with their invasion that was clearly aimed at Constantinople, they upset the European balance of powers. Those European nations may have hated each other, but they certainly didn't want a massive, overly powerful Russian empire dominating the Mediterranean and the Balkans. So in the end...
I think the Crimean War came after many decades after the Napoleonic Wars. And if European countries learned something about the Napoleonic Wars, is that you do not upset the power of balance. Because Europe, as much as they liked or hated each other, they didn't want a single country to be a lot more powerful than the others. And this sort of concept remained, and you could see it even in like the reasoning for World War I, like so many alliances to try to maintain the stability and not to have this balance of power tipped from one side to another. And Russia, with its huge imperial ambitions, always was a threat for that.
The Russians
like this part of European history is so
something
interesting.
That was almost impossible the year before. An alliance between the British, the French, and the Austrians
A consort
forced
of Europe.
the Russians out of the Balkans, and for good measure also sank the Russian fleet. But the resulting peace agreement exposed how the Ottomans' supposed allies and saviors were in reality just there to snatch bits and pieces for themselves. The British got even more concessions over Cyprus. The French gained the title of protector of Christianity in the Ottoman lands, and they would in the future themselves use it just like the Russians as a crowbar to justify wars. And the Ottomans had to give up even more control over Serbia and Romania. By this time, it would take drastic measures to save the empire, which the Ottomans conducted in 1856 by abolishing the Islamic Sharia-based social order, inviting foreigners to help build a new army, restructured the state to have equal direct representation for all ethnic groups, and even built a nice modern palace in European style as they adopted European dress codes. But these changes were mainly cosmetic and didn't have much impact on changing the overall situation, as things continued mostly as usual. Next came a rebellion of Serbs in Herzegovina who had risen up against Bosnian Muslim landlords. The 1860s brought a Greek insurrection in Crete and an uprising of Arabs in Lebanon.
Turks fighting
and this
Greeks.
was followed by the next great disaster. In 1876, the Bulgarians rose up in revolt. Probably sick and tired of it all, the Ottomans made a monumentally stupid and horrible decision. Instead of just putting down the insurrections as they had done so many times before, they sent an army that raped, burnt, robbed, pillaged, slaughtered, and massacred its way through Bulgaria.
Mistake,
in
brother.
an attempt to pacify the place by terrorizing its people, tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered. What this war is most remembered for are the mass beheadings. Every time an Ottoman army would march into a town, city, or village, all men aged 14 to 50 were gathered together in the town square and beheaded as the town was forced to watch. However, by 1876, newspapers were in wide circulation and had become part of everyone's daily life. Most nations had by then agreed to basic sets of rules of war that forbade the intentional slaughter of civilians. French, British, German, Italians, Russian, South American, and American journalists were all over Bulgaria, witnessing and writing about these atrocities. From one end of the world to the other, the news of what the Ottomans were doing spread, and the world united in disgust and condemnation of the Ottomans. Seeing all this, the Russians invaded. And this time, nobody was going to help the Ottomans. This war, the
Ooh.
11th Russo-Turkish War, was an even bigger disaster for the Ottomans than the independence of
yeah.
Greece and all its
Man.
previous military defeats. In the previous years, the Ottomans had tried to modernize their army, British and American rifles, German artillery, and British ironclad ships. But the Ottomans had not trained their army on how to use modern equipment and still relied on 200-year-old outdated defensive military tactics. They just hunkered down in trenches, hoping the Russians would do suicidal 17th century bayonet charges. Instead, the Russians shelled them into oblivion with modern artillery. The invading Russian army was also welcomed as liberators by the Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, and Serbs. The British and French only intervened and stopped the Russians when they were only a few miles away from Istanbul. In the resulting peace treaty, the Russians annexed the last remaining Ottoman lands in the northern Caucasus and East Armenia. Romania declared full independence and became a Russian ally. Montenegro declared independence. Serbia doubled in size, declared full independence, and became a Russian ally. Bulgaria officially became an autonomous state in the Ottoman Empire, but unofficially.
Disaster. Guys, where do you stand on the whole Turkey as a European or Asian nation? Because I've heard this debate a lot of times, and it's not really much of a debate, but it comes to debate when Turkey wants, for example, join the European Union. I think Turkey is just an Asian country with a lot of European influence, but we're seeing here it lost a lot of the European territories for a reason.
Was independent and allied with Russia. A mass exodus of Muslims fled these new states in what became one of the world's first recorded refugee crises. In total, 1.5 million who swamped the cities of the empire in slums and squalor. The modernized Ottoman Balkan army has been wiped out. The Ottoman buffer
Guys, we are
between
19
Russia
viewers. Welcome
in
to
any
this
future war,
stream.
The Russians could now just march right up to Istanbul. And it has also started something else. The Armenians had welcomed the invading Russians in eastern Armenia as liberators, and western Armenia was still in the Ottoman Empire. The Russians now declared themselves to be the protectors of the Armenians in that empire. The Ottomans now looked with ever-deepening suspicions on them. Something started happening that would, a few decades down the road, lead to one of the worst crimes of the century. However, the end of that war gave the Ottomans also a brief respite. And it came through another series of events that started during that war, something unexpected that must have seemed almost comedic at the time. During the war, when the Serbs marched south and doubled their land in size, they invaded.
Yeah, first of all, there's the whole problem with Cyprus, and then you got the whole, Erdogan government kind of thing. I'm not an expert on his government, so I'm not gonna really talk about it, but it doesn't look very good on the surface, at least. But yeah, I could see Turkey joining the EU. I had a friend that went to Istanbul, and it looks like a really nice, amazing city. So I could see that very, very soon. Exactly, it's like the cross point. Well, it's not. It's not like, it's literally the cross point between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. So you would expect it to be very mixed. Kind of have aspects of both cultures.
Greece. The Austrians threatened them into getting out of Greece, but the Serbs started something else with that. The Ottomans still controlled vast patches of Balkan lands, but in these lands, intoxicated by nationalist delusions of grandeur and even race, Serb, Greek, Bulgarian, and Albanian nationalists started killing each other before the Ottomans were even gone.
Guys,
so
20
they could have
viewers
war for themselves once those Ottomans
we
were
are balling right now.
For centuries, these people had lived together in peace and harmony, but with the idea of separation also came the need for new ideas, justifications, and fictions around which to unite a new nation around. In that climate, what separated people became more important than what they had in common. And what differentiated people often was arbitrary. Bosnians are not Turks, but Slavs who converted to Islam centuries ago. So are they Serbs of different faith, as some Serb nationalists claim? Or are they foreign invaders, as other Serb nationalists claim? Or something else entirely? Are Slavs that migrated to northern Macedonia Greeks? Are Orthodox Bulgarians Greeks? Who gets what cultural heritage? Should all Slavs be in one state? Should Greece have what it claims to have had?
The Balkans are always a mess.
As the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the Balkans, the newly emergent entities started engaging each other in hostility. Serbs against Greeks, against Bulgarians and vice versa, over who the people in the remaining lands were and should be part of. 30 years before the Ottomans had even left those lands. These fights were the forerunners of wars soon to come, but also the harbinger of greater catastrophes to befall the Balkans in the
1995.
closing years of the 20th century. During the war with Russia, the other European powers met at a conference in Berlin where they
The
divided
Berlin
Africa
Conference.
up amongst
This is
themselves,
interesting.
but also secretly divided up the remaining Ottoman lands in Africa without even telling them. The British made Cyprus a full protectorate and occupied Egypt, which was technically still an Ottoman protectorate. The French invaded Tunisia and made it part of their empire. The Ottomans were furious, but there was little to nothing they could do. Within a time period of only 70 years, the once mightiest empire...
Such a mess. The Balkans are such a mess. Let me share a little something with you guys, and I mentioned it probably in a couple of videos, but my family, I come from a Jewish family from Slovenia, but at that time it was Yugoslavia. So I do have a little bit of the connections to the Balkans. Beautiful countries, beautiful cultures, but definitely the messiest by far part of Europe. You know, we see Europe as this very stable, economically wealthy, prosperous continent, but the Balkans, you know, definitely need some fixing there.
Of the hemisphere had shrunken down to a fifth of its former size. A quarter of its population was still Christian, but it had lost almost all it had in Europe besides northern Macedonia.
Italian
northern
Libya
Greece,
would later be
Melia,
invaded.
and Crete. All its African vassals were gone, with the exception of Libya, which was basically just a scrap of sand and not worth that much. The Caucasus had slipped away into the hands of Russia, who were by now their biggest threat and right at their doorstep. The Mediterranean was now mostly under British control, and in the remaining Arab lands, the empire had lost much of its legitimacy as an Islamic spiritual leader, as the Arabs increasingly turned away to seek new leaders and solutions. In this mess, a group of idealistic young men would lash out in an attempt to save what was left, but in the end would only bring upon themselves the end of the empire.
The Young Turks in World War I. This is gonna be fun.
If you Google the Young Turks, the result you're going to get are mainly these clowns. A group of American
Clowns?
pundits who named
Bro,
their
chill.
show after the Young Turks. Why you would do that, I don't know. The result, however, is that this is what people think the Young Turks are, when the Young Turks were in fact someone else. It all started in the
Yeah, but I don't like any of these guys. I like Hassan as a streaming, but the Young Turks network, not a huge fan.
1800s. After several military defeats, the Ottomans invited foreign military staff to train their military officers in newly built cadet schools in places like Thessaloniki. A generation of young Turkish officer cadets, as well as a generation of Turkish students of law and medicine, had the opportunity to travel abroad and study the newest insights in technology, military leadership, and laws abroad. And it convinced them that something had to radically change.
Thank you. I like to think of myself as I'm not a scholar or a study of history, but I'm a fan. You know, it's what I like. That's why I upload the videos I upload, and especially modern, like for the last 200 years of history. That's my favorite part, and I really, really enjoy it.
Change if the empire was to be saved. They formed underground organizations such as the Committee for Union and Progress, but they became more commonly known as the Young Turks. These revolutionaries believed that for the Ottoman Empire to survive, it needed to reform and adapt to a new world where it would take its equal place amongst European empires.
Yeah, he's cool.
At the turn of the century,
cool
the
guy.
Ottoman Empire fell into another period of crisis. The Austrians occupied Bosnia, and dozens of rebellions flared up by Greeks, Armenians, Albanians, Macedonians, and Arabs. Within all this mess, the Young Turks seized the opportunity to seize power in 1908. The Sultan was forced into signing away all political power and reinstate a constitution. The Ottoman Empire became a constitutional monarchy, but in no way became a democratic society. But their ascent to power did not slow down the decline. Instead, it encouraged outsiders to take advantage of the instability. An Albanian uprising, a war with the new Balkan states, and a war with Italy were the result. The Ottomans lost their last lands in the Balkans, as well as Libya and strategically important Aegean islands to the Italians. And the uprising in Albania foreshadowed what was to
What a
come in
mess,
the following
bro.
decade. After crushing the rebellion, the Young Turk government banned the Albanian language, Albanian alphabet, Albanian schools, and Albanian traditional dress. By 1913, power resided with a military triumvirate under the three Young Turk pashas or military leaders, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. And with that, they also increasingly abandoned the idea that an empire of multiple ethnicities and faiths could successfully be preserved. Turkification was instead what they worked towards. As the Young Turks started to build a modern nation-state out of their empire, they sought new ideas and fictions around which to forge their new vision. The old ways, the ways of the religious hierarchy and Sharia, had to go. But what do we replace it with? The Young Turks adopted a nationalism through which they saw peoples in ethnic and lingual categories and classifications. They started using the word Turk when describing themselves and the land most Turks lived in. While the Ottoman nobility may have spoken
This is a big
Persian,
deal.
the Young Turks popularized the use of the Turkish language as a rebellion against the corrupt royal elites. This was an era of nationalist movements across the world trying to reaffirm and reassess cultural independence and identity. In Ireland, Gaelic cultural organizations formed and playwrights wrote pieces like Kathleen Houlihan, which had the distinct purpose of separating Irishness from Britishness and rediscovering and reinventing an Irish cultural identity. In China, nationalists overthrew the Manchu monarchy and reinvented a new Han Chinese republican national identity. The Indian National Congress increasingly protested the British presence in India, and what happened in the Ottoman Empire was no different than the child of its time. The Young Turks searched for national figures and heroes
absolutely.
to reinvent a Turkish culture. The word Turk comes from a tribal name of the old Turkic era and means strength. They rediscovered a medieval Turkish poet and religious mystic, Yunus Emre.
Man, I love this. Kraut is such... He's the best, man.
Who broke
He
with
is
the
the best.
standards
Mad
and customs of
respects
his
to him.
time by refusing to write poetry in Persian and refusing to preach religion in Arabic, instead doing so in the common Turkish language of the peasants. He was declared to be the father of the Turkish language, which, however, isn't really true. He just wrote in Turkish to reach more people. Young Turk leaders and politicians such as Ziya Gökalp defined the new Ottoman Empire as a society consisting of people who speak the same language, have the same education, and are united in their religious and aesthetic ideals. And the problem with that increasingly spreading nationalism was that it left no room for others. Your ethnicity, your language, your faith, and the way you practiced your faith became increasingly relevant in this society. The Young Turks became increasingly racist over time, looking down on Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and Alawites with increasing racialized contempt. As a
I did
people
not
who
know this
supposedly
at all.
refused to become part of the modern world, or as a foreign and enemy entity from within. With passing time, they became increasingly volatile and also delusional. Enver Pasha dreamt of a great Turkic empire stretching from the Balkans to China that he would conquer for a unified, ethnically Turkish empire. The idea in itself is nonsensical. The Turkic cultural sphere contains various different languages and cultural expressions. Even the notion of a Turkish race, after centuries of assimilations and integrations of different peoples, is purely nonsensical. Yet those facts...
It kind of reminds me of the idea of Mussolini and a new Roman Empire under Italian rule. Like, it wouldn't make a lot of sense.
did not delude the delusions of grandeur that some within the Young Turk ranks had come to believe. A Turkish empire was to be built, and those within it who were not Turks would have to assimilate into becoming Turks or go. The Young Turks aligned themselves with the German Empire, dressed like German officers and generals, and saw the German Empire as an exemplar model for how to build their new empire. As such, they helped drag the empire into the First World War, which first and foremost exposed one thing: their incompetence.
Really? Could we say that? Could we say that the German Empire was similar to the Ottomans? Because I don't see it like that. The German Empire was born out of the unification of German states, mostly German states, maybe like a few that weren't, but mostly German states, while the Ottoman Empire was kind of more like Austria-Hungary, to be honest. A multi-ethnic, multilingual empire, and even multi-religious empire. So, did it have a lot of similarities to the German Empire? Don't really think so. More like Austria-Hungary, in my opinion.
Jamal Pasha marched south, intent to take Egypt from the British, lost, got bogged down, and took out his frustrations by mass hangings of Arabs and Assyrians, which resulted in the Arabs increasingly despising their Turkish overlords. Enver Pasha had the genius idea of invading Russia without preparing for the Russian winter, with predictable results. He came back and instead of taking
Why everybody does this? Nobody prepares for the Russian winter.
responsibility, blamed the Armenians.
Shit, it's gonna get dark.
Within the new nationalist vision for the Ottoman Empire the Young Turks had, the Armenians were by not being Turkish and by not being Muslims already separated from the remaining population as different. To emphasize the difference, even though claiming to abandon the old hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks took advantage of it by branding the Armenians as kuffar, or unbelievers, as beneath the Muslim population. The Armenians never rose above the status of being second-class citizens, even as the Ottoman Empire reformed. After the failed rebellions of the late 1800s, even the Young Turks denied them legal rights and equality with the remaining population.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see the whole enemy thing. And yeah, definitely he said that they were trying to copy or
As
model
the Ottoman
after
Empire
Germany.
was at war and had suffered significant military defeats, the Armenians were an easy pick as scapegoats for all that had gone wrong. In response to a rebellion in Van that had been artificially aggravated by the Ottoman army, the Interior Minister of War made the decision to mass deport the Armenians. Enver Pasha, on May 2nd, 1915, gave his seal of approval
Hola, hola.
to this via letter.
Caleb, thanks for joining.
The Young Turks sought to remove the Armenians for nationalist reasons, on the grounds of removing an ethnicity from their society. But to achieve this, they went by a different means, appealing to the Islamic beliefs of the majority population. They called for a jihad against the non-believers and appealed to people to rid the empire of the kuffar. Lists were made of Armenian intellectuals and community leaders, camps established, soldiers were given orders, militias were armed, and camps built for the purpose. When the order was given, Armenian community leaders and intellectuals in urban areas were arrested and killed. Armenians were forced to leave their towns and deported south into the Syrian desert in forced marches. Up to 1.5 million Armenians died in the deserts of Syria, forced to march through the deserts or left in camps with neither food or water. They succumbed to thirst, hunger, and disease. Every genocide has its deniers. However, the traces of what happened cannot simply be wiped away. Travel through eastern Anatolia today and you will see the empty Armenian churches wherever you may go. The Armenian genocide is denied by the Turkish government and Turkish academia to this very day. And the society that cannot confront the demons of its past is a society that will be haunted by those demons. As such, we will encounter this genocide again in later chapters. The genocide in the end didn't help the Young Turks change the tide of war. As the Russian Empire collapsed, the Armenians in the east broke off to form their own republic, now even more hostile towards them. The Arabs rebelled en masse and harassed the Ottomans from Arabia to Damascus, something the British would take advantage of. And the British expeditionary force took Basra and Baghdad. In the end, the Young Turks only signed their own death warrant with what they had done. The world had noticed what had happened, and for what they had done they would, in case of defeat, not be able to merely surrender, but would be wanted men for the crimes that they had committed.
Of course, absolutely. Think about the Nuremberg trials and World War II. I mean, people were responsible for this, and for all his mistakes, like Donald Trump deported a Nazi officer at the age of like 94. People to this day are still being accountable for the genocide of the Jews in World War II. I mean, this is sad. It's a chapter of history, and we should acknowledge it and acknowledge it. I think that's it. Reflect on it. Learn about it. And it's sad, bro. I hate this kind of stuff. And the fact that it's not acknowledged. That's what's insane. Because, for example, when you look at German society and World War II, I remember at my school, back in high school here in Mexico, there was a German girl. She came as an exchange student for a year. And, I remember when I tried talking with her about World War II and Hitler, she was, maybe it was a mistake on my part. She was so embarrassed and so sorry, and like she didn't even want to talk about it at all. The fact that the government, probably not the Turkish people, but the Turkish government is denying this to this day. It's absolutely, I don't know why it's happening.
Our story, the story of modern Turkey.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe he missed that one. Honestly, I'm not well versed on it. So, Caleb, today we are reacting to the Turkish Century. It's a documentary from a YouTuber called Kraut. He did an amazing documentary that I loved about the Mexican-American border because I'm Mexican, so I loved it absolutely. And that's why what we're reacting about. And hi, all the love for California.
Turkey
I went to San Diego like a year ago. Absolutely loved it.
Gallipoli. And to fully understand and appreciate, we need to go back to be introduced to the man who would make and shape modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He was born as Mustafa in 1881.
We're gonna talk about the Ataturk
which is
now.
Today's Thessaloniki in modern-day Greece. It might seem weird to you, but in the Ottoman Empire, commoners did not have last names, only the royal family did. Growing up in Ottoman Greece as a Turk would impact his views in later life. The experience of being part of a minority in a majority culture, but also in that he was exposed to the nationalism and ideas of the Greeks around him at the time. Not just if Greece should be an independent state or not, but whether it should be a Hellenic kingdom or a Hellenic republic.
By the way,
in school he
I know a little bit. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I do know about the Ataturk because, not only, I think the Ataturk name means the father of all Turks. So that, that'll probably tell you that guy is a big deal. But every time a leader from a non-European nation tries to modernize his nation, deserves a little bit of recognition. And I wish in Mexico we had a guy like that.
He would excel at maths.
So
and
mad
prove to
respect
be a
for the
very
Ataturk.
intelligent kid, resulting in his teacher giving him his second name, Kemal, from the Arabic word for excellence. After school, he would enroll in an Ottoman military academy in northern Macedonia, and later in the Ottoman Military Staff College in Istanbul, pursuing a career as an army
Turk
officer.
daddy himself.
It was through his path through the military
He kinda
institutions
is,
of
though.
the empire that he met and joined the various revolutionary movements around the Young Turks. He himself also got the chance to travel abroad and also formed revolutionary organizations such as in Damascus, with the intention of reforming the empire. He was in many ways a rebel. He smoked a lot and even drank a lot of alcohol, which was highly forbidden in the empire. He read illegal
Maybe
literature,
us great
discussed
leaders
with his
drink a lot.
comrades how the empire should be reformed, and at one point even landed in jail for his activities. But there were big differences between him and the other mostly Young Turk officers. Most importantly, he was not a Young Turk. Neither did he believe in their ideas and plans. The Young Turks mainly looked for their inspiration on how to reform the empire to the German Empire, and to German nationalism as something to copy. The strict militaristic state hierarchy of what was basically a military dictatorship was in their opinion the only way to save the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa Kemal, however, disagreed. He was more interested in what he had seen in France, in particular the French Republic.
And that is the difference. Military dictatorships never make it. I mean, Germany, the German Empire was a huge powerhouse. They lost World War I and World War II because military dictatorships don't work. And you can see it in Latin America, for example. They never work.
He saw the pluralistic political system of the French Republic and its desire for progress and advancement in society and the sciences as a better model to copy. He learned to read and speak French, and as such, while the Young Turks read the translations of Prussian militarists, Mustafa Kemal preferred reading the works of French revolutionary and Enlightenment philosophers. In particular, his favorite one, Auguste Comte, a positivist who strictly rejected all forms of metaphysical thought, advocated for the advancement of society in
he was a
thinking and actions
reader.
reasoned and based on scientific facts and research, and in particular, advocated for mankind to liberate itself by abandoning all forms of religious ballast and superstition. Generally, in the
This.
history of the last 200
This,
years,
bro.
Comte's writing had more of an impact than most are even aware of. They are basically the foundation of modern French secularism, known as laïcité, and you will find one
The
of his
good
quotes
France, the
about
bad
achieving
Germany,
order
the
and
ugly
progress,
England.
at least partially, on the flag of the Brazilian Republic, whose founders were readers and admirers of Comte. But most significant for our
Yeah, Kant is really good. You should read it. And thank you, Caleb. Thank you for saying my English is good. I think I need a lot of improvement to my accent or the way I pronounce certain words, but I worked hard for it. Thank you very much.
story, they shaped the political thinking of the young officer cadet Mustafa Kemal. He believed the
I
young
do know
Turks
a
didn't
little
go
bit.
far
I'm not an
enough, but they
expert, to
still
be
clung
honest. I
on
never
to
claimed to be
old
an
and
expert
outdated
on
traditions,
any
but
of
their
these
thinking
topics
was
because
still
it's
by and large
complex.
backward, that the German Empire they
But I do
modeled
enjoy
themselves after was also backward,
this
and that
enlightenment
only
era.
radical social and state reforms modeled after European republics such as France would be the solution. You might have even heard or read some of his quotes from this era.
There is only one civilization, the European civilization.
Oh,
There is no second civilization. Civilization is the European civilization. And it must be established here, with all of its thorns and roses.
wow. All
There
right.
was a
Interesting.
second large
This could obviously be very debatable, but, it's debatable.
point of disagreement between
would- I
Mustafa
would
Kemal
mostly
and
agree.
the Young Turks. And that disagreement was probably the biggest one with which Mustafa Kemal was also largely ahead of his time. He didn't believe that the empire should continue. He believed that the age of empires and colonialism was coming to an end. He also rejected ideas like
Smart
Enver
man.
Pasha's Turanism, the idea of a pan-Turkish empire stretching from China to the Balkans, as fantasies and delusions. Instead, he
Smart man.
advocated for a small Turkish solution. The empire should disband, and it should give up rule of the Arabs and the peoples of the Balkans. He also believed that empire held nations back, that for the Ottomans being tied into the Islamic world,
Smart
in
man.
particular the Arab world, tied the Turks into religious-based political and social backwardness. Therefore, Turkey should give up the idea of being the leaders of the Islamic world, reject all cultural influences from there, draw borders around the smaller, more compact, and mostly ethnically and lingually unison Turkish homeland, instead of seeking deeper ties into Arabia and Iran, and to build new bridges into Europe and North America and rebuild itself as a modern Turkish nation-state. By the time of the Young Turk coup, Mustafa Kemal had risen to the rank of colonel, and by the entry of the First World War was one of the most experienced military leaders of the Ottoman army, with combat experience in the war with Italy and the Second Balkan War. But because of his beliefs,
I mean,
he was
he's truly
kept away
quite a
from any
man to
political
be
power,
to
even
study.
any significant military post. His relationship with the Young Turk government was strenuous at best, but eventually he was given a post commanding a division in Gallipoli, and it was there where he proved his worth. Unlike many of his Young Turk
Oh,
contemporaries, he
man.
didn't just dress like a soldier,
He
but
took
actually
part
was
in
one. He had a
Gallipoli.
better understanding of modern warfare and the defensive tactics of trench warfare. When the British sent an army of Australian and New Zealand troops to take the Dardanelles and Istanbul with the intention of knocking the Ottomans out of the war, he correctly anticipated where the attacks would take place, to then organize and command a successful defense and what would be the first Ottoman victory of the war. The victory at Gallipoli changed his prospects, as the German allies, but also the Young Turks, had to recognize his potential.
Yo,
But
Winston
far more
Churchill,
important
where
for
you
later
at?
years, the fact that he was fighting in Gallipoli kept him clear of any involvement in the Armenian genocide that was taking place at the same time. He was promoted to general in 1916 and given command of part of the army in the Caucasus, where the Russians had recently launched an invasion of Anatolia. Under his command, the Russians were defeated at Bitlis, halting any further Russian advances. This victory made it abundantly clear that Gallipoli had not been a fluke, and that he was one of the most competent commanders in the Ottoman army, for which by 1917 he was put in charge of Ottoman forces in the Levant, facing the British and the Arab revolt. But there were no victories to be found there. After years of incompetent leadership under Jamal Pasha and his attempts to terrorize the Arabs into obedience, the Ottomans had all but lost control over Arabia. Jerusalem fell to the British, as did Basra and Baghdad, and the Arabs were in
Under the commander of T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, great general. Also, read about that man. It's very interesting.
full revolt in the remaining lands. By 1918, the Arab revolt had their biggest victory when they took Damascus and started marching on Aleppo. Faced with what would have
Wow,
been
look at
certain
that
defeat,
flag.
Mustafa Kemal decided to instead save his army and organized a retreat back into Anatolia. It was at this point, literally in the same week that Mustafa Kemal retreated his army into Anatolia in fact, that the Sultan, Mehmet VI, reached out to the Allied powers for peace and had an armistice signed. The 3 Young Turk Pashas, who had dragged the Ottoman Empire into this catastrophe in the first place, as well as conducted the Armenian genocide, all fled abroad to escape being held accountable. Which in the end didn't help them much. Talat Pasha was shot dead by an Armenian in Berlin in 1921. Enver Pasha was killed by an Armenian Red Army officer in the Caucasus in 1922. Jamal Pasha was killed in Georgia in 1922 by a group of 3 Armenians. And many other senior Young Turk figures involved in the Armenian genocide who had fled abroad were killed by Armenians. It is also often forgotten today that in the aftermath of the war, legal action was taken against many of the Ottoman officials who had partaken in the Armenian genocide in the defeated Ottoman Empire. This was demanded by the Allies.
Shit, guys, I have to be real quick. So give me just a little second. All right. Sorry about that. It was a really quick pause, too.
and also endorsed
Well,
by
I don't
Mustafa
need to be
Kemal,
specific
who
about
wrote,
it.
It is our main wish that the rule of law be applied impartially, and that complete justice begins. Since the responsibility in our country is equally shared by young and old, the punishment should not only remain on paper, thereby remaining only propaganda which can lead to many unnecessary discussions, but should be carried out, since this would successfully impress the foreign element.
The court-martials set up by the Istanbul and Ankara governments were, however, lackluster, designed in a way that cabinet members could influence outcomes and sentencing, and many of those involved managed to escape punishment. By 1920, in the Paris suburb of Sèvres, Sultan Mehmet VI was made to sign the Treaty of Sèvres, a peace treaty even harsher than the Treaty of Versailles was on the Germans. The Ottoman Empire's lands in Arabia were to be divided up between the British and the French. Eastern Anatolia would be divided up amongst the newly formed Armenian Republic and the new Kurdish state.
This is a very controversial argument, and one argument that I love to have, because we tend to see the Versailles Treaty as a very harsh treaty against the Germans. But in reality, was it that harsh? Was it really that different for other treaties at the time when other countries lost the war? I don't think so. I don't think it was that harsh, especially compared to like the treaty the Ottomans had signed.
Southern Anatolia would be given to the French. Eastern Anatolia divided amongst the Italians and
Greeks,
The
yeah.
Dardanelles and Istanbul would become a formerly international zone, however under British occupation, so basically part of the British Empire. The Turks would be restricted to a small remaining rump state in northern Anatolia, which was 15% of what the empire was before the war, and under a de facto colonial supervision. Adding to that were crippling reparations, and it became abundantly clear that the Turks were to have their lands divided up as colonies to the victors. This treaty was unacceptable to Mustafa Kemal, who in mid-19...
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was more of a cultural blame for the war rather than a treaty itself that was harsh. Oh, in the next coming days, like the next parts, I'm loving this so far. So within the next week, you should see the following parts. So and then again, we can stream at 7 p.m. 7 p.m. Mexico City time
1919 was tasked with
within the next
reorganizing
week.
the Ottoman army to crush any resistance
Because I'm honestly
against the
loving
treaty of the
this.
Sultan in the remaining rump state. Instead, he assembled a congress and from the small town of Ankara declared independence from the Sultan's government and proclaimed to resist the foreign occupation of Anatolia, beginning the Turkish War of Independence.
Turkish
That war,
independence,
from
right.
the onset, seemed absolutely hopeless. The Turks were on their own and pretty much surrounded. The Greeks used this crisis to invade Anatolia in an attempt to build a greater Greece. The Armenians also invaded in an attempt to take the lands inhabited by Armenians before the genocide. The French army occupied vast parts of southern Anatolia, intent on dismantling Ottoman state and cultural structure.
Awesome,
A
thank you very
large
much.
British fleet was anchored
Aram,
in Istanbul,
I don't know
and
if
the
I'm
Kurds
pronouncing
by
that
now were
correctly.
eager to build their own promised state. But a series of events at the beginning of this conflict
Thank you
pushed
very much. I
things
really
into
appreciate all
Mustafa
the
Kemal's
support.
favor. The British found oil in the Kurdish homelands of northern Mesopotamia, which led to them betraying the Kurds. Instead of giving them their own homeland, they clustered them into the new colonial administration of Iraq under Arab overlords. The remaining Kurds in Anatolia consequently sided with Mustafa Kemal, who promised them equality under Turkish rule and the resurrection of the Caliphate. Things looked far tougher in the east, as the Turks seemed to be in for a long protracted war with the Armenians. However, in 1920, out of the blue, the Soviet Union invaded Armenia and annexed it. With that, there were no more threats from the east. To the south, the French got bogged down in the guerrilla war with the local Turkish population, and in early 1920 were defeated by the Turkish National Army under Mustafa Kemal's command,
Oh my
leaving
God.
them with no other choice but to retreat back into French-occupied Syria. By far the biggest threat were the Greeks, who seized control of Anatolian lands that were actually promised to the Italians and marched into central Anatolia with one victory after another. The Greeks got close to taking Ankara but were halted and pushed back by 1921 under Mustafa Kemal's command. The war ended in 1922 with the Greeks retreating and the burning of the Greek city of Smyrna, which would later be rebuilt and renamed to Izmir. The end of the war with the Greeks pretty much solidified a Turkish victory, and the British rather
Think about Ataturk greatness. Like, I, for example, coming from Mexico, and again, I have to mention Mexico because that's the place I live and that's the place I'm more familiar with. Like, when we defeated the French, it was a huge deal. Cinco de Mayo, you probably guys know that. It's a huge celebration because us, the Mexican army, this really weak army, defeated the second or third best army in the world. It's a huge deal. So imagine Ataturk defeating many, many armies, including the British, the French, the Greeks, supported by the Italians. It's a huge deal. It's a very, very massive deal because you're defeating the best armies in the world by yourself. Well, not by yourself, but with the army. So it's a huge deal. And that's why people like him so much, with all the other stuff that we mentioned in the past.
than fight, decided to abandon Istanbul and make peace with the Turks. This victory was a triumph that would cement Mustafa Kemal as a national hero even before he had established his state. There are only 5 countries in the world that avoided being colonized, most through concessions and alliances with other countries.
Yeah, look at this group. Ethiopia, Thailand, Iran, and Turkey, and Japan.
In the world
It's
that
a very
avoided being
exclusive
colonized, most through concessions and
club.
alliances with other empires, or by becoming colonial empires themselves. Turkey is unique amongst them, in that under Mustafa Kemal's leadership, it is the only one which managed to avoid colonization by fighting those who sought to colonize it, and more importantly, doing so on its own and outnumbered. It made Mustafa Kemal the savior of the nation and the revered leader and anti-colonial hero, even outside of Turkey, where many leaders in Arabia, Iran and Pakistan would seek to copy him in the future. This war, however, also significantly changed the social makeup of Anatolia. There used to be a Greek population of up to 2 million people in Anatolia before the First World War, and with the burning of Izmir, the last big Greek population center disappeared. You can today still travel throughout the coastlines of Anatolia and you will find empty Greek towns and villages whose population packed and fled between 1914 and 1922. In the peace agreement, the League of Nations ordered a population exchange. 1.5 million Greeks were to leave Turkey and head for Greece, while 1 million Turks were to leave Greece and head for Turkey. It is important to note that today this would be considered to be ethnic cleansing. but at the time it was seen as a legitimate policy measure to guarantee peace. But, as we would see later, it didn't. What it did, however, do was change Anatolia, which for millennia had been a place of multiple cultures and faiths. The Christian population was reduced to a mere 2%, and the Anatolia Mustafa Kemal inherited was a by and large ethnically and religiously monomorphic society of Sunni Muslim Turks. Thousands of these Turks watched in late 1923 as the last British ships and troops left Istanbul. They all still wore the traditional Islamic headdress for men called the fez. Most of them probably had no idea that they were witnessing the dawn of a new age and the radical break with the past, unprecedented not just for Turkey, but in all of human history. On the 29th of October 1923, the Turkish Republic was declared after the Sultanate had been abolished in the previous year. The only thing that this republic would keep from the past was the flag.
Okay.
The politician who needs help of religion to govern is nothing but an idiot. For more than 500 years, the rules and theories of ancient Arabic sheikhs, Muhammad, and the absurd interpretations by generations of filthy and ignorant clergy in Turkey dictated all civil and criminal law. They dictated the state from the Constitution, the smallest of activities and gestures of citizens, their diet, the hours of rest and labor, the choice of clothing, the curriculum in schools, our manners and habits, and even our most intimate thoughts. Islam is a rotting corpse that is poisoning all of our lives. There are many different nations, but there is only one civilization. A prerequisite for the progress within a nation is to be a part of that civilization. There are no differences between the Orient and the Occident. There is only a difference between backwardsness and modernity.
A man of strong opinions.
The fez was a traditional Islamic headdress worn by men across the Islamic world. It originated in North Africa, and throughout the 17th and 18th century, it became increasingly widespread throughout the Islamic world. From Indonesia to Morocco, devout Muslim men would wear it, just as devout Muslim women would wear the veil. It became the official headgear of the Ottoman army uniform, and even non-Muslims who resided within the Ottoman Empire and Muslims who lived outside of the Ottoman Empire would wear it. It signified loyalty to the Caliph, the Islamic social order, the Ummah, and the Caliph's authority over the Islamic world. You can see the fez on the heads of the cheering crowds as the Turkish Republic is founded in 1923. At that time, 80% of that republic's population lived in the countryside. 90% could neither read nor write. Ideas such as nationalism, republicanism, liberalism, progress, modernity, science, or secularism were something most people had never even heard of. A national identity didn't exist, and most group identities were restricted to clans, religious groups, and family structures within rural villages. This was not a population that could carry and advance a revolution, especially since they wouldn't even understand what a revolution was or what they were doing it for, which consequently would shape what Ataturk's revolution would be, one dictated from the top to bottom, and not the other way around as revolutions usually go. This, in return, would leave behind a legacy of governance enforced autocratically from top to bottom, no matter what the wider rabble may think of it. Within a period of 14 years, the world of the average Turk was turned completely on its head. On the 3rd of March 1924, Mustafa Kemal formally abolished the caliphate. This might seem like nothing to you from an outsider's
No, it's a huge
perspective,
deal.
but remember, the Sultan and the Caliph were two separate institutions. The Sultanate had been abolished 2 years before with the founding of the Republic, but the Caliphate had still existed. There were many sultans throughout the Islamic world throughout its history, but there could only ever be one caliph. The Caliph was not a pope of the Islamic world, but considered to be the spiritual descendant of Muhammad and to represent his authority as a religious authority to
It's
all
a
Muslims.
huge deal.
The Caliphate had existed since Islam itself existed. The title had gone from the Umayyads to the Abbasids to the Ottomans, and was seen as an integral part of the Islamic faith and the understanding of the Ummah as a community of Muslims in the world under a leader. And with one stroke of a pen and the presidential proclamation, Mustafa Kemal abolished it. Gone was a central element of the
The
Islamic.
balls on this man. Imagine abolishing the caliphate. That's a huge deal for Islam as a whole. And I remember watching a documentary on how many Islamic countries tried to bring the caliphate back, but it just wasn't a thing. It wasn't possible. So this is a huge deal. This is important, and it takes balls to do this. Whether you think this decision was right or wrong, it takes balls to do it.
Islamic world, an authority to all Muslims and their understanding of themselves as a group identity and part of a community that had existed for over 1,000 years. The consequences of this decision were monumental. Mustafa Kemal had promised the Kurds to protect the caliphate in the War of Independence,
Shit,
which
I have
resulted
too
in the
much
first
whiskey
split
today.
between the Kurds and the Turks. But the consequences were even larger beyond the Turkish Republic. It completely shattered a key element in how many people in the Muslim world saw and understood themselves. What are we now? Who are we? What is our tribe? Our identity, our community? Are we still Muslims? Can Islam persist without the caliphate? Are we nationalities? Are we Asians? Are we Africans? Are we Arabs? Are we Iranian? Are we races? Are we comrades? Are we a community? Can Jews or Christians be part of our community? Can we live with Hindus? Are we kings? Are we republicans? Are we back in the 6th century? What? Where? Who? How? Many, if not most, of the problems throughout the Islamic countries in identity, politics, and nationality can be traced back to this fateful moment. From Gamal Abdel Nasser's proclamations of Arab nationalism, to Iran's Shah proclaiming himself to be a living god, to Jinnah founding a separate Muslim nation in India, to anti-Semitic pogroms in Iraq and Morocco, to the Saudis dragging their society back into the late Iron Age. On the 4th of April
Literally?
1996, when Muhammad Omar founded the Taliban, he broke open the chest of the cloak inside the Shrine of the Cloak in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where Muhammad's cloak had been kept for centuries, and wrapped himself in it, proclaimed before his followers that he was the legitimate representative of Muhammad, the Caliph of all Muslims, leader of the new caliphate, and that the false gods of nationalism, democracy, and communism had failed. Events echoed when bin Laden proclaimed his war to restore the caliphate to the black flags recently flying over Iraq and Syria. It is still too early to say what the full consequences of Mustafa Kemal's decision were when he abolished an institution that he thought of as too backwards to be reformed and therefore had to be destroyed. But make no mistake about the tremendous impact that this decision had throughout
Huge,
the world.
huge.
But for Mustafa Kemal, that decision was just the starting shot. He followed it up by banning the fez, turbans, niqab, and burqa, and the criminal penalty. The hijab was banned in public spaces such as schools and government buildings, and women who, throughout most of the history of the Islamic world, had been silent figures forced into the background by religion, were told to come forward and be public beings and figures. This was followed by the closing of all Islamic schools. Keep in mind that at the time, all schools were Islamic schools, and the Sunni clergy held a monopoly on
made history
education.
for
This
sure.
was now over. New schools were opened. The curriculum was entirely secular. Religion was scrapped entirely out of education, and education
This man was
compulsory
truly a
and far more
revolutionary.
radical. It was also compulsory for girls
Radical,
who
right?
had previously,
Yeah.
due to Islamic customs, been denied any and all education. This was followed by all women being granted and guaranteed legal equality before the law. And that was followed by the abolition of the Islamic calendar. It was no longer the year 1344, but the year 1925, as it was throughout the rest of the non-Muslim world.
Again,
Next,
big
he abolished
decision.
Sharia law in its totality in each and every
Wow.
corner of the legal code, be it civil or criminal law. No more special taxes for non-Muslims, no more restrictions of freedoms, no more prohibition of alcohol, no more punishments for apostasy or other. He introduced freedom of consciousness, making
Huge.
it possible for Muslims to convert to other faiths, or even openly leave their faith and be open atheists. Marriages.
I mean, this man has truly, like, the things he did, consequences in Turkey. And I was surprised. I've never been to Turkey, unfortunately, but I do know people from Turkey. And when I first knew like the things they would tell me about Turkey. It's such a secular nation, especially what you hear. Let's be honest, like the news you hear about Muslim nations are not the best. So when I heard so like how Turkey was a secular nation on its own, I was like, wow, I was shocked. And then learning about history, and I loved Ataturk as a figure, one of my favorites historical figures on its own, because it's like he's a revolutionary. This man changed his nation for good, or for bad, whatever you think of him.
Between faiths and lack of faith
But I like him
were now legal
a lot.
without a spouse being forced to convert, as it would have been
I'm an
under
atheist,
Sharia.
if you don't know.
Mixed faith
So-
couples could now raise children together, which was forbidden under Sharia.
Mixed
The Islamic
race
courts,
couples.
Sharia justices, and the Sheikh ul-Islam, the highest religious legal authority in the land, were
It is. It is the Anatolian Peninsula, one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And what he just said, let's try to figure it out. Mixed race marriages in the U.S. were illegal until like the 60s. So the fact that in an Islamic nation, mixed race marriages were allowed in the 20s, that's huge, man. That's huge.
were all abolished. He introduced a civil code of criminal and civil laws, shaped after examples set in Europe and North America, the first and so far only majority Muslim country to ever do so. Next,
So
he
far.
banned the call to prayer from minarets at mosques. Next, all imams became state bureaucrats on government payroll, under control by a secular government institution. What could and could not be preached during religious sermons had to be approved by the state. Preaching in Arabic was abolished and had to be conducted in the Turkish language. Next,
Wow.
the Turkish alphabet was Latinized. The old Persian Arabic alphabet was replaced at all state and commercial institutions and schools. All adults who could read and write had to learn the new alphabet. All who couldn't read or write were taught to read and write with the new alphabet. All children would be raised with the new alphabet. Government advisors cautioned
Yeah,
Mustafa
literally.
Kemal to do this slowly and that it could only be done over the course of a decade.
Like
But
a lot of the things that were even illegal in places like, and I have to mention the U.S. because that's the place that I'm more familiarized with. But like racial marriages, tolerance for other religions. I mean, this guy was truly changed Turkey for the better, but left us with a lot of things that we can learn from him and from Turkey.
Mustafa Kemal persisted.
Now I
and had
guess
this
we'll
reform
we'll
pushed
later
through in
talk about
5
Erdogan.
months. Next, all Turks had to take
And
last
how
names. Until then,
he's
people
kinda
throughout
backwards.
the Islamic world had mostly only had 1 or 2 names, but there was no such thing as a last name or a family name. Mustafa Kemal changed that and took the last name Ataturk, which means the father of the Turks. He was the only one to
Yep.
take this name, and since he had no children, he would, in Turkish history, be the one and only father of the Turks. Next, Islam as the official religion.
Man, I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous that that Turkey has such an amazing figure.
Of the state was cut out of the republic's constitution. This was then followed by secularism being written into the constitution,
Wow.
defining the Turkish Republic as a state that
Secularism.
separates
Damn.
religion and state. And there's a note to be made here. The Turkish word for secularism is laikik, which is a francophone, a French loanword in the Turkish language based on the French term laïcité. And that is important because
In Spanish, the word for that it's laico. So very similar to French and in this case even Turkish.
French secularism isn't your average secularism. While most modern republics define
It's
the
hardcore.
separation of religion and state as a freedom of religion, in which citizens are free to worship, believe and practice their faith, and even base their politics on their religious beliefs as long as they don't force them upon others, French separation of religion and state, which is called laïcité, is defined as freedom from religion, in that you, the citizen, are freed from religion by the state. It bans religious dress from all government and public institutions, be they parliament or school. It forbids any and all religiously inspired or dictated social policy, be they through private organizations or elected officials. This uniquely French interpretation of secularism, derived from the French revolutions and its thinkers like Auguste Comte, is controversial to this day, as it gives the French government the authority to restrict religious expression in public, such as banning the burkini and burqa under criminal penalty. It also gives the French authorities the power to restrict private religious programs.
Now, this is obviously very controversial in France and I'm not going to get into it, but as a Mexican that also lives on a laico state, right? Free of religion, I'm grateful and I enjoy it.
And activities that the state determined to contravene the common good. For example, offering a pseudo-medical procedure known as gay conversion therapy in France is punished with a $60,000 fine
Yeah,
and a 2-year
Mexico too,
prison
I think.
sentence. Laicite is far more invasive and has a more hands-on approach to the separation of state and religion than in most other
Shit, I have to pee again. Sorry, guys. We're back. Thanks, guys, for not leaving the
republics and
stream.
democracies. And it is this type of separation of religion and state which Ataturk adopted for his new republic. Turkish society was torn down to then be rebuilt and modelled after the European states of the time. But Ataturk didn't just want to catch up with the modernity of his neighbours, he wanted to outdo them. But where could he? In what regard were European and American nations still lagging behind in progress? These were for most modern states technologically advanced with legal equality for all men, but mostly only
Oh,
for men.
men.
At the turn of the decade, women's equality movements had sprung into action as they had never before in human history. This is where Ataturk saw an opportunity to show off the progress of his new society to the outside world, and to even hint on how his new republic might soon overtake all the others. In the decades before, the Ottomans had made a point of showing off their princes to the outside world as symbols of the empire. Ataturk turned this on its head. He adopted several young girls who showed promise in education and accomplishments, such as Afet İnan and Sabiha Gökçen. Afet İnan became an accomplished anthropologist and historian. Sabiha Gökçen became the world's first Air Force pilot, and they both were presented throughout the world as symbols of progress within the Turkish Republic. Most countries represent themselves through national symbols, such as a national animal. Within this concept of national symbols, France is unique as it represents itself as a woman, the famous Marianne, leading the revolution. Ataturk decided that the symbol of Turkey was to be a modern, dark-haired Turkish woman leading the nation to progress. These were the images that Ataturk wanted the world to see. No longer should Turkey be seen as this weird backward nation where veiled women are hidden.
I mean, what you said, Abysmal, but we're not only talking about an Islamic nations, and I'm sorry if you're from an Islamic nations, but they are generally very conservative towards women or minority. But he out-modernized not only the other Islamic nations, the European nations, which is amazing for such a time like the 1920s, 1930s. It's something that nobody did before. this man was huge, not only for Turkish history, but we're talking about global history now. He out modernized European nations, which is not something that happens very often. I am fine, estoy bien. Muchas gracias, Juan Caudillo. Muchísimas gracias por tu comentario. And I generally don't speak in Spanish, but ahora pueden escucharme hablar en español.
Behind closed doors, but a forward-thinking republic where a female president of a university and acclaimed
Estoy
historian
bien,
can
la verdad un poquito
congratulate
afectado
American
por
women
el
receiving
whisky.
the right to vote and finally being the equals of their Turkish sisters.
Amerika kadınlığını takdir ederim. Çünkü siyasi haklarını
Wow, wow, wow.
Türk kadınları da şimdiye kadar aldıkları haklarıyla
Think about this. A woman from an Islamic nation congratulating American women for achieving their political rights.
etmeyeceklerdir.
Mind blowing.
One of Ataturk's biggest projects was his new capital. At first, there was
Ankara,
confusion
yeah.
when he moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. Istanbul had been one of the world's most important metropolis for millennia. Ankara was comparatively nothing, a small town with a population of barely 30,000. But this was done for good reason. Compared to Istanbul, which had geographically been a central location in the larger empire, Ankara was geographically more central within the geography of the new republic. It was easier to access, had the only rail network leading into the south, and contained the headquarters of the army. But more importantly, the small size also served another purpose for Ataturk. He could build a new city for a new state in a new century. At a time when modernist architects were persecuted by fascist movements in Europe, Ataturk invited many of them, such as Bruno Taut, Clemens Holzmeister and Paul Bonatz, to come into a Turkish exile and build a new capital with him. What they built was the futuristic Ankara that we know
Crazy
today.
man.
Detached from many concepts of traditional Middle Eastern style of buildings, a modern European metropolis was stamped out of the ground. If you visit the city today, you will find the symbols of another cultural revolution that took place here, manifested in architecture. Best symbolized with the Road of Lions, because these lions are imitations of 10,000-year-old Hittite bronze figurines. Adding to that, the coat of arms that Ataturk chose for his new city was a Hittite sun wheel, and the Road of Lions is also not far away from the newly built Turkish National Museum, filled with Hittite, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman and nomadic artifacts. This might seem small to you from an outsider's perspective, but symbolized another monumental break from traditions and customs in Islamic societies. Before
history of
Ataturk,
Anatolia.
pre-Islamic cultures and relics were considered to be barbaric or even as sacrilegious or demonic by Islamic societies. In Arabia, ancient pre-Islamic castles and temples are being destroyed to this very day. Ataturk's new vision for his new state required the forging of a new national Turkish identity, and that new identity based on nationality, heritage and language made the ancient pre-Islamic civilizations part of that national identity. The Turks were to no longer just see themselves and identify themselves as just a part of a wider Islamic community, but to take pride in an identity with a wider historic legacy that included nomadic horsemen and ancient Anatolian civilizations. All of these reforms, the complete restructuring and reorganizing of a society in such a radical way, like it had almost never been done before or since in human history, happened within 14 years.
What a
between
beast.
1923 and 1937.
What a champ.
The goal behind them was to create a modern state, shaped after a European republic. But precisely the problem there is that republics are more often than not societies with a right to self-determination for the individual. Ask yourself this: is a society that forces you to not be religious any better than a society that forces you to be religious?
Nope.
You might find forced political religiosity and religious doctrine more contemptible than forced secularism, but a key component in both remains the force. Erziehungsdiktatur is a term coined by the German historian Harald Neubert, who spent the final years of his academic career trying to figure out why the Soviet Union had failed. The word basically translates to educational dictatorship or the educating dictatorship. The idea is that the state was ruled by an ideological minority who found their legitimacy not through public approval but within their own beliefs and saw it as their role to rule as dictators until the public would finally be educated enough to see the validity of those beliefs and elect them through their own volition.
The fall of the
in
Soviet Union is very
the
interesting.
dictatorial experience merely educated the people into rejecting that ideology. Ataturk's state was in many ways such an educational dictatorship. Ataturk saw himself as the first and last dictator of Turkey, the one dictator that the nation needed to educate it into never having another dictator again after him. The problem he had was putting this into effect. In 1925, he encouraged opposition figures to found a liberal opposition party with the intention of gradually democratizing society. However, seeing this as a weakness, disgruntled remnants of the Young Turks attempted to assassinate him, and the Kurdish Sheikh Said launched a rebellion to overthrow the republic, to reinstitute Sharia and re-establish the caliphate. The project of Turkish democracy was put on rest, and Ataturk responded with harsh measures, executing the remaining Young Turk leaders and launching a heavy military crackdown against the Kurds. It was after this backlash that he somewhat backtracked his previously more radical positions.
We believe that religion, which for the longest times has been used as an instrument of politics, must be liberated from politics to be elevated. We cannot abuse our holy faiths as instruments of politics.
Wow. What a guy.
It is unclear how sincere he may have been when making this statement. Ataturk himself had stopped practicing Islam in 1923, but besides the conflict with the religious population, the Kurdish uprising of 1925 also exposed other problems with the new vision of the Turkish national identity.
I mean, and me as an atheist really admire him for his policies, not only on a Muslim nation, which is just considering that most of them are pretty conservative nowadays, but like out modern in Europe, it's just
the fact that it was built on a new nationalist identity formed exclusively around the Turkish language, heritage and culture. It left no room for Kurds, thereby sowing the seeds for inevitable future conflicts. It was an idea that
and nobody's
left no
saying
room
he
for
was
any
perfect.
Cultural,
No
legal,
historical
to some
figure is
extent even
perfect.
political
None of us humans are
aberrations.
perfect.
However, the pluralism that Ataturk wished for this society to achieve requires such aberrations and diversity to exist. To ensure that his vision for the future after him would be safe, Ataturk established the National Security Council, an institution of generals that had the expressed permission to intervene in the politics of the country by force if the constitution of the secular republic was ever under threat of being undermined. A role usually given to civil opposition, and the Supreme Court was thereby handed to the army, guaranteeing even more future conflict potential. The cracks in all of this would show at some point. Decades later, it would be revealed that Sabiha Gökçen, the war hero, a national symbol of Turkish social progress, was actually an Armenian, a genocide survivor adopted from an orphanage by Ataturk. The diversity in this society was still there, it was just hidden behind the scenes.
Massive respect. Oh no,
Mustafa
he's
Kemal
dead.
Ataturk died on the 10th of November 1938 at 9:05 in the morning. It is an easy historic date and time to remember, because every year on the 10th of November at 9:05 in the morning, the sirens go off in all Turkish cities and towns, and everyone stops in their tracks for a minute of silence.
Oh my god.
For outsiders,
this 10th of November, which is actually not that far, today it's 21st of October. This 10th of November, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to stop everything I'm doing and pay a minute of respect to the Ataturk.
It seems somewhat weird to observe, almost like a personality cult in a dictatorship. But this is really not the case. Ataturk is genuinely revered by the Turkish people, who to this day see him as the savior of their nation and the founder of their modern society. To this day, they go to his memorial in Ankara in the millions to pay their respects.
Millions.
Years ago, when I first looked into this topic and had a conversation with a Turkish friend, I commented on how weird it was to me that Mustafa Kemal called himself the father of the Turks and was abruptly interrupted by a "No, we call him the father of the Turks." As we go forward into the story of the Republic, you will find that Ataturk's shadow dominates.
Think about a politician that it's admired like that.
Dominates over this state
There ain't
and
a
its
lot of
people
them.
throughout their journey through the 20th century. No other political figure would have as much of an impact on this country as he did until 2003.
We're gonna talk about Erdogan, man. Shit. Oh no, it's over. No! God damn it, Kraut. This could have been 3 hours long and I would have watched it. Man, what a video. What a video. It ended on such a note that I'm pretty happy about this. We talked, like, look at this. We talked a lot about the Ataturk. Like, probably over half an hour at least. Yeah, man. Oh, so sad. I really wanted to. I mean, I can watch another. I mean, it's over an hour, and I don't know if I can watch it. But man, I'm a huge fan of the Ataturk, and I did know him before this video, and I probably guessed that Kraut was really gonna talk about him on this video because such an important figure. And me as an atheist, like I said, I live in a majority Catholic nation, a nation that's very Catholic on its traditions, and they take Catholicism very seriously. So for me, the Ataturk represented that. Living on a society free of religion or free of persecution. You could practice religion, but you could also have the option of not practicing religion. And living on a hardcore Catholic nation, for me, that was very important. And I admire him on a personal level because of that. You haven't watched the other parts? Oh man, how long do they last? Let's watch. Let's see. We could maybe do it. I mean, I know there's a lot of you watching from Europe and it's very late. The other part, it's 1 hour, 20 minutes. Shit. I don't know, man. I don't know. Honestly, I drank a little bit too much whiskey that I'm comfortable with. So another hour and 20 minutes. I also don't want to bore you guys to death. Oh, shit. But I know maybe we can do it. Let's talk a little bit about the video we just watched. It's insane, man. Really fun. Turkey as a nation, incredibly influential. The Anatolian Peninsula, incredibly influential as a region, because Europe is not the only important region that's historically important, but it's incredibly important as a whole. And me being Mexican, like European culture is obviously very influential, and European history incredibly influential. So yeah, it was a great statesman. I mean, think about that. A politician, because he was at the end of the day that a politician that's loved by the people, considered the father of all the Turks. And like what he said, the statement that he said, no, we, the Turkish people, call him that. I mean, mad respect. You know a politician was good if the people love him. He was great. He was great. And I am having trouble if I'm gonna do a reaction to the next videos. I mean, I'm obviously gonna react to them, but should I do it today? There's also a video like this. Look, how vodka ruined Russia. Liberal democracies explained. Shit. The origins of American gun culture. Trump biggest failure, and it's China. Just a massive China haunting on Trump. And of course, the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful documentary of the Mexican-American border. If you're American, I think this is a must-watch. The Mexican-American border. Because it's beautiful. It truly suggests that like teaches you the history of both nations, Mexico and the US, neighbors, but in a mixed way. You learn about the US and its colonial past, and you learn about Mexico and its colonial past. It's truly, the Trump video is so good. Oh man, I really want to watch it. Historia, what's the name? Historia Civils. You know, we could watch an extra video. I can watch an hour long because it's late, and I respect you guys' time, and I also respect kind of that I am just tired and a little bit drunk. and I can't stand another hour and 20 minutes. And I want to pay respects to his reaction, but let's see. Historia. All right, I think this is the one. Peace. Peace. You guys want to watch it? I mean, I'm totally down. We have a picture of old Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Empire. Guys, talking about American gun culture, as a Mexican, I didn't really have a lot of culture shocks when I visited America, because Mexico is fairly similar to America in a lot of ways, and it's very Americanized. But one of the things that truly shocked me was the gun culture in America. Yeah, me neither. Historia Sig, but it has over 800, well, not over, almost 800,000 subscribers, which and 86 million views as a whole. So, man, oh, we have a notification. Well, let's watch this. I mean, you guys are down for it. And I am down.
I'm writing this in April 2021, and for no reason whatsoever, I have spent the last year thinking about low probability events. All kinds of low probability events. The ones I keep coming back to over and over again, you might say obsessively, are great power conflicts. I should briefly explain what a great power is. A great power is a global power, one that matters outside of its own region. If you can imagine a random crisis breaking out in a random part of the world.
Awesome, T-Man. We'll be waiting for you.
That would be consulted
I actually want to pee again.
Directly involved. A great power conflict
I'm not gonna
is
do it.
quite simply a large-scale war between several great powers. These wars have become low probability events, but when they do happen, the results are always
catastrophic. Yep.
One of the features of a great power conflict.
What do you guys think about this? This is a question that always comes up. You should react to part 2. I really want to do it, Ismail. I really want to do it, but it's an hour and a half long, and I want to pay its own respects. You know, like right now I'm a little bit tired. I'm a little bit drunk, and you guys probably are also tired. But we can do it. I mean, if you guys are up to it. You know what? I also want to watch this video separately because it seems like it's pretty good. Not now, man. Yeah. Let's wait. Let's wait a couple of days. Let's do this. All right? Let's do this. I'm going to be posting. I'm gonna stream at this hour because this hour seems to be working for a lot of you guys. So what do you think about 7:30 p.m. Mexico City time, which I don't know in your time zone what that is, but right now in my time zone it's 10 p.m. exactly 10 p.m. 10:01. So we can do a stream about part 1. We can even do it tomorrow. For this video, that's over 1.5 hour views, and I'm gonna keep this video. Oh, sorry about my notes. I'm gonna also keep this video to do a reaction for it because I like this. I like it very much. You know, peace. Do you guys think there will be a World War III? I honestly don't. Which is the beginning of this video, I think. A great power conflict. I don't think there will be any world war anytime soon. But yeah, guys, I think I'm gonna save a later reaction for this later. So right now we're gonna end the stream right now. I really enjoy streaming because I love talking with you guys about history. It's just one of the topics that gets me going. I enjoy it so much. You know, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to history, especially late history. So I love talking with you guys. I love the stream. We have now 12 viewers, and the fact that 12 people around the world are watching this video is just insane to me. So thank you guys so much for being here with me today. I really enjoyed your company. Good night to all of the European viewers that stayed a couple hours awake just to see this video. I appreciate y'all, and maybe next time we can do it a little bit early. And man, all the love to Kraut, the original channel that made this documentary possible, because he makes such great content and he deserves way too much subscribers. So yeah, definitely, I loved the first part of the Turkish documentary, and be sure that I'm gonna be continuing it very soon. Within the next week, we're gonna end the Turkish series, and probably tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, we're gonna watch the second part. So stay tuned for the community tab on my YouTube channel, because I'm gonna be posting the time for the stream, so you guys can tune in and we can talk live, because I think that's what makes a live stream special, that the fact that we can talk. It's 5 a.m. in Germany, man. Shit, man. I'm sorry, dude. I'm sorry. We're definitely gonna do it a little bit early, all right? But I really appreciate, you don't know what it means, man, to me, that you're staying awake for my videos, my shit. It means a lot, man. And I really thank you, especially, particularly to you, Oirad9, for staying awake. It means a lot. And I think you were with me on a past stream. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, guys, for liking my stuff. Honestly, I'm not doing YouTube because of the money. I'm doing this because I enjoy it. And the fact that so many people from around the world are watching my content, it's just an idea that I couldn't even fathom. But anyways, I don't want to bore you anymore. If you like the video, share. And something that really helps me is if you check the links in the description and watch my Skillshare classes. That helps me monetarily. Of course, a like and a subscribe, and you know the deal. So thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you on the next stream.